In the beginning there was only the void. There was no earth and no sky, no sun and no stars, no sea and no stone. There was no wind, because there was nothing for a wind to cross. There was no cold and no warmth, no day, no night, no way of telling one from the other. There was no floor beneath and no roof above, and no shore where a thing might stand. There was not even darkness, since darkness would have required a light, and no light had been made. Those who came long afterwards gave the emptiness a name. They called it Ginnungagap, the yawning gap, and they spoke of it quietly, in halls that smelled of smoke and wet wool. It was not a place, it was the absence of every place. It held nothing at all, not even time, which had not yet been thought of. How long the gap lasted. Nobody ever said there were no years in it to be counted, and nothing in it that could have done the counting. It simply held, unbroken and unlit, for as long as it needed to hold. But the emptiness did not last. Out of that nothing in the end, everything came. A tree would grow up through the middle of it, an ash of impossible height. 9 worlds hung in its branches and its roots like fruit that was never picked. Water gathered under it in 3 wells. Beasts lived in the tree and gnawed at it without pause. The tree bore them, because bearing things was what the tree did. There was to be a wanderer on the roads of those worlds, grey-cloaked, one-eyed, a wide hat pulled low. He had not been born one-eyed. He went down to a black well beneath the root of that tree and asked for one drink of the water. The price named to him was an eye. He paid it without argument. He gave a great deal away in his long life. He never once got back the thing he most wanted. There was to be a wolf raised inside the halls of the gods, fed by hand, spoken to kindly. He grew a little larger every night, and after a while the gods stopped mentioning it to one another. They bound him at last with a ribbon softer than any thread of wool. They knew the whole time they were binding him which of them he would eat. There was to be a winter 3 winters long, with no summer laid between them. There was to be a ship built out of the nails of dead men, and a horn blown once. There was to be a plain 108 leagues across, with everything living standing on it. After all of that, unexpectedly there would be grass again. They would make a world out of a body and hang the sky with sparks. They would forge gold in the dark, break an oath for the sake of the sun, sew a mouth shut with an awl, and lose the finest hammer ever made. It was to be a history so long and so patiently kept that the last man who believed a word of it would be 700 winters dead before the story stopped travelling. It began with ice at one end of the emptiness, fire at the other, and nothing whatever between. Part 1, Ginnungagap. For a long age, nothing happened in the gap at all. Then, at either end of that emptiness, 2 countries came into being, and no telling ever explained how. To the north lay Niflheim, the house of mist, which was cold. To the south lay Muspelheim, which burned between them. The gap went on being nothing, mile upon mile, in no particular direction. At the middle of Niflheim lay a spring called Vegelmir, the roaring kettle. 11 rivers rose out of it and ran outward. The old poems kept every name. There were Sval and Gunthra, Fjorm and Fimbulthul, Slider and Hrid, Silg and Wielg, Vid and Leiptra. Last of them came Gjol, which ran closest of all to the gate of the dead. Together they were called the Alivagar, the ice waves. They carried a bitter venom out of the spring with them, the way a river carried silt. The rivers ran so far from their source that the venom in them hardened, the way slag hardened when it was drawn off a forge. Then the water froze over the slag. Rime grew on the ice, and drizzle fell on the rime and froze in its turn. Layer went down upon layer, each thinner than a fingernail, for more winters than anyone would ever attempt to number. The ice crept south into the gap, blew at its heart white where the wind had scarred it. It made no sound at all. While it did this, Muspelheim at the other end was light and hot and shut against anything not born there. Nothing grew in it. Sparks came off it constantly and went out into the dark of the gap like ash lifting off a burning roof. At its border sat a figure called Surtur, black against the glare, holding a sword that burned along its whole length. He had been sitting there since before there was anything for a border to keep out. Did nothing for age upon age. At the end of the world he would do one thing and it would be enough. So the rime came down from the north and the sparks came up from the south. The two of them met in the middle of the gap. The northern part of that space stayed heavy with frost and hanging mist. The southern part glowed, but in the middle the air was as mild as a windless sky in spring. The rime that drifted into it began very slowly to thaw. But the drops that fell from the thawing rime did not fall as ordinary water would have fallen. They gathered and quickened and took on the shape of a living thing. There was no god yet to intend it, and no craftsman, and no word spoken over it. Life simply began in the middle of nothing, because warmth had been brought to ice. What stood up out of that thaw was Ymir, the first and the largest of everything that had ever lived. Ymir was not good. The frost giants who came after him called him their father. They gave him a second name, Orgelmir. None of them pretended that he had been kind. He slept a great deal, since there was little else in existence to do. While he slept he sweated, and under his left arm a man and a woman grew together out of the sweat. One of his legs begot a son upon the other. Some said that son had 6 heads, and no one who repeated it seemed troubled by the number. Out of the same thaw, in the same hour, a cow came into being, and her name was Ordhumla. 4 rivers of milk ran from her udders, and Ymir fed on them. That was how the first living thing was kept alive. The cow herself had nothing to eat but the rime. She licked the salt out of the ice, hour after hour. The ice was salt to the taste, white with frost, and cold as iron left out in winter. On the first day of her licking, hair came out of the stone where her tongue had passed. On the second day, a head came out of it. On the third day, a whole man stepped out of the ice. His name was Buri, and he was fair to look at, tall and strong. Buri had a son called Bor. Bor took a wife named Besla, the daughter of the giant Bolthorn, and she bore him 3 sons. The eldest was Odin, the others were Vili and Vi. The 3 brothers looked at the world they had been born into and found only Ymir in it, filling everything, breathing slowly, endless. Odin said, "Nothing else will be made while he stands." Replied, "Then he must not stand." They set on him together and killed him. It took all 3 of them, and it was not quick. So much blood came out of the wound that it went over the whole gap in a flood, and it went fast. Every frost giant then in existence drowned in that flood except 2. Bergelmir, the grandson of Ymir, climbed into a hollowed trunk with his wife and rode the blood out on it. Whether the trunk had been a boat, a cradle, or a coffin, the old verses disagreed and left it to be imagined. From those two the race of frost giants began again in the cold country at the edge of things. They remembered the flood. They never afterwards looked at the sons of Bor without remembering it. The brothers took the body and carried it into the middle of Ginnungagap. They made the world out of it piece by piece. His flesh they laid down as earth. His blood they poured into the low places, and it became the sea, and the sea kept the salt of it. His bones they stood up as mountains, his teeth and the splinters of his broken bones they scattered as scree and shingle and loose grey stone. That was why the high ground of every country afterwards lay covered in it. His skull they raised over everything as the sky, but a roof of that weight would not have stayed up unhelped. They set a dwarf at each of its four corners to hold it. Their names were Nordri, Sudri, Austri and Vestri, which meant north, south, east and west. They had nothing else to do forever. His brains they flung upward, and those became the clouds, and the clouds went wherever the wind pushed them. These eyebrows they set up as a fence around the middle of the world, to keep the giants outside it. Within that fence they made a country for men, and called it Midgard. But the dark above the new earth was still empty, and nothing in it gave any light. So the brothers went to the border of Muspelheim and gathered up the sparks still coming off it. Some they fixed in the vault of the skull to stand still, and those were the stars. Others they set loose on paths given to them, and those wandered. 2 lights they made greater than all the rest, and gave a driver to each. One was a girl called Sol, and the other a boy called Mani. Their father had named them too proudly, and lost them for it. Was given a chariot and 2 horses, Arvakr and Alsvinna, with bellows of iron set beneath their shoulders to keep them cool. Mani was given the other road, and the reckoning of years, and the waxing and the waning. Behind each of them, from the very first morning, a wolf was already running. The one behind the sun was called Skoll, and the one behind the moon was called Hati. The gods watched the wolves run, and knew, without hoping otherwise, that both would catch what they chased. In the dead flesh of Ymir, under the new turf, maggots had bred while the brothers worked. The gods gave them wits and the shape of men, and let them keep the dark they were already in. They were the dwarves. Modsognir was the first of them, and Durin the second. They went down into the earth and the stone and stayed there. Whatever was made well in the 9 worlds afterwards, the dwarves made the greater part of it. But the land inside the eyebrow fence had nobody living in it. So 3 of the gods walked along a shore of the new world. The sea lay grey there, and the tide had gone far out. 2 pieces of driftwood had come up above the waterline, an ash and an elm, salt-bleached and half-buried in the sand. They had no breath in them, no wits, no colour, and no fate of any kind. Odin knelt and breathed into them both. Then he said, "Let the ash be called Ask, and the elm Embla." His brothers gave the rest. One gave wit and movement, and the other gave warmth and blood and the colour of a living face. Some said those 2 had not been Vili and Vi at all, but Honir and Lodr. The poems never settled the matter. Something in that hour moved Odin more than the raising of the sky had done. He would not have been able to say why. He had built the sky out of a dead thing, patiently the way a man roofs a barn. These 2 he had made out of driftwood and his own breath, and they looked back at him. Ask and Embla stood up on the shore and were the first 2 people. Every man and woman afterwards came down from them. The gods gave them the land inside the fence, and clothes and names, and left them to it. Behind them the sky was still new enough that nothing had yet worn a track across it. The grass ran green all the way down to the tide line. The flat water gave the light back without a mark on it. At the centre of everything, in ground that nobody had walked on yet, a small ash was already up. It stood no taller than a child, with 3 roots going down into places that had no names. Part 2, Yggdrasil. The small ash on the empty ground grew. It went on growing for longer than the making of the world had taken. Men were born inside the fence and died, and were forgotten in numbers that nobody recorded. The gods raised halls and grew used to having them, all that, while the tree went up and out and down. In the end, there was nothing left in any direction for it to grow into. By the time anyone thought to describe it, the ash held every world there was. Men called it Yggdrasil, which meant the horse of the dread one. It was a name the tree had not always carried and had not yet earned. It was the greatest and the best of all trees. Its limbs stood out over every country there was, and over the sea beyond the last of them. The highest of them stood above the sky itself. Nothing that walked had ever seen the whole of it at once. Those who tried came away with a description of one part, told slowly as if that were all there was. 3 roots came out of the trunk and went 3 separate ways. One went up and over toward Asgard, where the gods lived. One went out east to the country of the frost giants, across the ground where the old gap had been. One went down over Niflheim, into the cold that had been there before anything else. Under each root lay water, and each water was different from the others, and each was older than the root above it. Under the root that reached Asgard lay the well of Urd. The water in it was holy. It was so holy that everything touching it went as white as the film inside an eggshell. The gods rode down to that well every day to hold their court. Their roads stood in the air. They gave judgments at the water and went home again. 2 swans fed on the water of the well, going quietly up and down it. The poem said that every swan afterwards came down from those 2. Beside the well stood a hall, and in the hall lived 3 maidens. Their names were Urd, Verdandi and Skald. The names meant what had already been, what was coming into being, and what would have to be paid. They cut the life of every man into a piece of wood, and set its length, and consulted nobody about it. Kings and thralls came out of their hands by exactly the same method. That was 99 parts of the reason men feared them. Each morning the 3 drew water from the well and took white clay from the bank around it. They poured both together over the tree, over the great roots, and up the bark as far as their arms would reach. They did it so that the limbs would not wither and the trunk would not rot through. It was the plainest work being done anywhere in the 9 worlds, and it was never once missed. Nothing in creation would have lasted a year if they had stopped. But the water under the 2nd root was of another kind entirely, and it was guarded. Out toward the country of the frost giants it lay, and it was called Mimir's Well. Wisdom and understanding lay in it, the way silt lay in a river. A keeper sat beside it who had drunk from it every morning of his life. Nobody drank from that well without paying for the drink. What the keeper asked, and who paid it, were not told on the same day as the making of the tree. That was a later matter and a colder one. Under the 3rd root, down in Niflheim, the water of Hvergelmir went on boiling and roaring. It had done so since before there were gods to hear it. The 11 rivers still rose from it. The cold had never lifted there, and the mist stood on the water in the shape of the country underneath. But the tree was not left in peace, and it never had been. Something was eating it from every direction at once, all day and all night, and had been from the beginning. In the water of Yggdrasil lay the serpent Nidhogg, who gnawed at the root from below. He was not alone at the work. More serpents lay under that ash than a fool could count, the poem said. A few of them were named Gwyn and Moin, Grabak and Grafitnir, Ofnir and Svafnir. The rest were left without names. The wood wore away, and the wood grew back, and neither side had ever gained a hand's breadth on the other. Above, in the high branches, 4 stags went along the shoots with their necks bent back. They cropped the newest growth as fast as it came. Their names were Dane and Dvalin, Dunir and Durathor, and their antlers came together and parted again as they fed. Higher still stood the hart, Eicthanir, who cropped the limbs of the tree that men called Lerada. Water ran off his antlers, drop after drop, all the way down into Hergelmere. Out of Regelmere the 11 rivers went out again to every country there was. In the crown of the ash sat an eagle who knew a great many things. Between the eagle's eyes sat a hawk called Vedafalnir. Between the eagle at the top and the serpent at the bottom ran a squirrel called Ratatosk. He carried words up the trunk and words down it, all day every day, and he improved them in both directions. He told the eagle what the serpent had said about him, and then went down and told the serpent worse. Nothing in the 9 worlds was more industrious, and nothing accomplished less. 9 worlds hung on that tree, and each of them could be told by what a traveller would have found underfoot. In Asgard the ground lay level and green. Halls stood on it with roofs of shingle and gold, and their smoke went straight up in still weather. Vanaheim was a soft country of harbours and rain and slow brown rivers. Its people knew things the gods of Asgard did not know. Alfheim had been given to the light elves, who were fairer to look at than the sun, and who were said to be quiet. Midgard lay in the middle, fenced about with a giant's eyebrows, ringed by a sea that nobody had ever sounded. Jotunheim lay east and outward, black rock and standing water and scoured pine. Wind came off its mountains hard enough to lean a body into. Its steadings were larger than any hall in Asgard. Below the turf lay Svartalfheim, and lower down lay Nidavellir. Some said those two had always been one country under 2 names. Whichever it was, the dwarves worked there. Their forges went day and night, with iron and burnt hair on the air. The sound of the hammering came up through the floor of the world. But 2 of the 9 had never altered by so much as a stone. At the far ends of everything lay the oldest countries of all. Niflheim kept its mist and its rivers and its cold, and the dead went there in time, down under the 3rd root. Muspelheim kept its fire. Surtur kept his place at the border of it, the burning sword across his knees. He had not moved. He was in no hurry at all. Between Asgard and Midgard the gods had built a road, and it stood up in the air with nothing beneath it. Men looking up from the fields called it the rainbow. It had been made of 3 colours, and it had been made of fire. The fire in it was what kept the frost giants off. It trembled underfoot the way a rope bridge trembled. Its name was Bifrost. The gods rode down it every day, and not one of them ever thought it strong. But the road had been built with an end in mind, and a watchman set at the head of it. At the Asgard end stood a hall called Himinbjorg, and Heimdall lived in it. He needed less sleep than a bird. He could see 100 leagues by night as well as by day. He could hear the wool growing on a sheep and the grass growing out of the earth. He heard each of those sounds separately. His teeth were gold. He drank good mead in his hall and watched the road. Beside him he kept a horn called Gjallarhorn, which had never once been blown. He was keeping it for a single morning, still a long way off, and he knew that the morning would come. The tree suffered more than men ever knew. The heart bit, the top of it, and the 4 stags stripped the new shoots. The sides of the trunk rotted where the weather got into the wounds. Nidhogg tore at the root from below, and the nameless serpents worked beside him. The white clay went on being poured over the damage each morning by 3 pairs of hands. Nothing was ever cured, and nothing was ever finally lost. The ash simply endured it the way a thing endured what it could not help. It would endure the fire at the end of the world as well. It would go on standing when the water had closed over everything else. Out toward the country of the frost giants, under the second root, the well lay in the open with no wall built around it. Nothing moved on the surface. It took no light down from the sky and gave none back. It lay so still that the rime on the stones at its edge went undisturbed for whole winters together. At the bottom of that, well, down in the black, an eye lay open, looking up. Part 3. The Wanderer. Hlidskjalf was the high seat that stood above every roof in Asgard. Whoever sat in it could see the whole of the 9 worlds at a single glance. There stood the burning border of Muspelheim and the boiling spring under Niflheim. Between the two lay everything settled in the wide country. Odin climbed to that seat more often than any god there cared to admit noticing. He looked because the seat let him look. A ruler who did not look was a ruler who did not know what was coming for him. The view cost him more than it ever gave the few others who tried it. From Hlidskjalf, a watcher saw not only what stood at that hour, but what was still approaching. Odin, alone among the gods, had already seen an ending laid out at the very beginning. He carried that knowledge the way a man carries a stone in his pocket. He forgot it for whole days at a time, then felt its weight again on a stair. Long before the high seat was raised, Asgard had no walls worth the name. Even then Odin had gone looking for a different kind of sight. He went down to the well under the second root of the great ash. The water sat black and close beneath a lip of stone. It came from nowhere that could be seen, and it gave off no smell and made no sound at all. Beside it waited its keeper, on a stone worn smooth by long sitting. He was a being named Mimir. Odin came to that well wanting a single drink, no more than that. He believed one drink would tell him what 100 years of watching from Hlidskjalf never could. Mimir did not refuse him outright, and did not offer the water freely either. He named a price plainly, the way a smith named a price for worked iron. The price was this, an eye cut from Odin's own head. It was to be dropped into the well, to lie there for as long as the well itself stood. But Odin did not turn from the water and go home. Almost any other god in Asgard would have done exactly that. He drew the knife at his belt, without asking whether some other bargain might be struck. Then he cut the eye from his own face and let it fall. It went down slowly, turning once in the black water. It settled on the stone bottom among small pale rocks that had lain there since before Ymir's blood filled the sea. The pain of it he never described afterward to anyone, not even to Frigg. He knelt at the edge with the wound still raw and drank a long, unhurried draught. In that single drink he learnt more than the eye had shown him in its whole life of looking. He would keep the wound uncovered for the rest of his days, a half-shot reminder that wisdom in that country was never lent. It was only ever sold. That was not the only price he paid, nor the last, nor even the greatest. Some while later, with no one troubling to count the years between, Odin went out again. This time he went to the tree itself. There he did to himself what no one else in any of the 9 worlds would ever have dared to do to him. He hung from a windy branch by a rope of his own tying. While he hung there, he drove his own spear into his own side. The offering would be complete only that way, himself given to himself on a tree that answered to no one. For 9 full nights he hung turning slowly in the wind. No hand gave him bread, and no hand gave him a horn of mead. The whole meaning of the act was that nothing at all was given. He looked down through hunger and blood loss into the roots below him. In the dark down there, water and worms and the long white bones of the world all lay together. But on the 9th night, something in that darkness resolved itself and rose to meet him. He saw the runes. He never said afterward that they had been shown to him. He said only that he saw them the way a man sees a shape standing in smoke. The shape had been there the whole time and needed only a certain angle of the eye. He screamed once, and the cry ran down through every root of the tree at the same instant. Then he took the runes up, cut and reddened. Soon after, they gave him mastery over things that had never before answered to speech. A word from him could blunt a sword already swinging in an enemy's hand. A line spoken over open water could calm a rising storm. A certain low chant said over a gallows could call the hanged back down to speak with him plainly. Death. There was only a kind of sleeping. He came off, the tree changed. No one who met him afterward across any of the 9 worlds ever again mistook him for merely one god among many. He kept a strange household from that time on, and it grew stranger the older he became. 2 ravens left his shoulders at first light every morning and came home to his table each evening. Their names were Hugin and Munin, thought and memory. He worried more in the quiet of his own mind about Munin failing to return than he ever admitted worrying about Hugin. A lost thought could always be thought again, but a lost memory was gone for good. At his feet lay 2 wolves, Kiri and Freki, and he gave them his whole share of meat at table. He lived on wine alone himself, since a god who ate nothing solid had no real need of teeth at any feast. He carried a spear called Gungnir, forged so true it never once missed what it was thrown at. Men afterwards swore their gravest oaths upon its point, believing any lie sworn there would be found out before nightfall. Among his other treasures lay a plain, narrow ring called Draupnir, and it would matter again before this telling was finished. Of all the halls he kept, none was described so often as Valhalla, the hall of the slain. None was described so fondly either. 540 doors stood in its walls. Through each of those doors 800 warriors would one day walk abreast on the single morning the hall finally emptied itself out. Its roof was laid with shields instead of shingles. Its rafters were spears set crosswise, so firelight ran along the whole ceiling as if it were already burning. A boar named Sehrimnir was boiled whole in a great cauldron every evening and fed the entire hall. It stood whole again each following morning to be boiled once more. On the roof itself a goat named Hydron cropped the leaves of the tree above the hall. She gave mead instead of milk from her udder, enough to fill the drinking horn of every warrior seated below her. The warriors had died in battle and were carried up by the Valkyries. The Valkyries rode out over any field where iron was being used on flesh. They chose from among the fallen which of them Odin wanted at his table. But not all the slain went to Valhalla. Half of every battlefield belonged instead to Freyja, who kept her own hall called Folkvang. She chose her share first, before Odin's riders ever reached the ground. In a third hall, called Fensalir, sat Frigg. She knew the fate of everything living in the 9 worlds, and spoke none of it aloud to anyone, not even to her own husband. Least of all did she speak of what she already knew concerning a fair-haired son of hers. She never suspected how soon that knowledge would be tested rather than merely kept. But all of that gathering, hall after hall of it, amounted to an army being raised. No enemy had yet been named aloud anywhere in Asgard. Odin counted doors, set his ravens flying, and drank the mead poured for him at his own table. Even so, he understood that the army being gathered would not in the end be large enough. He never once said this to the warriors he welcomed through those 540 doors. He welcomed each of them exactly as if the hall stood forever, and the last morning would never come to empty it. On the roads between the 9 worlds, in those years travellers now and again passed a stranger walking alone toward dusk. His cloak was grey. A wide hat was pulled low over one side of his face. An old wound kept carefully out of sight beneath the brim. Part 4, the first war, before that wandering had gone on for very long, war came to Asgard. It came from an unexpected direction, not out of Jotunheim, where every earlier quarrel had started. It came instead from among beings the gods had first mistaken for kin. A stranger walked into the hall one evening, a woman with a look about her. None of the gods sitting there could quite place it. Her name, when she gave it, was Gullveig. She carried gold with her, worked and unworked, more of it than any single guest had ever brought into that hall before. Rings were stacked to her elbow, a talk of twisted wire lay among them. Small worked lumps of raw metal sat there too, still rough from the fire that had shaped them. Torchlight ran over all of it while she stood in the doorway. For a long moment nobody in the hall said a word. What she wanted in return was never fully agreed upon afterward. Not even those sitting closest when she asked for it could say for certain. The gods did not care for what her presence stirred up among them. Greed woke in halls where it had been lying quiet for a long while. Old friendships cooled overnight for no reason anyone could name aloud. Men who had shared mead and bread without counting either began within days to count both. But the gods did not sit idle while it spread. They seized her by some accounts on Odin's own word and burned her where she stood in the middle of the floor. Smoke went up thick and black through the smoke hole. The smell of it stayed in the wool hangings for a long while after she rose out of the ashes hole. They burned her a second time, and a second time she rose. They burned her a third time, certain by then that the fire would finally hold her. But she climbed up out of it a third time as well, unmarked, gold-eyed, entirely calm. After that, no one in the hall suggested trying a fourth. She walked out of Asgard under a different name, calling herself Hyde. She was a seeress who worked side the craft that let a skilled hand see forward into what had not yet happened. Now and then that hand could reach into it as well. Wherever she travelled afterward, some quieter wickedness seemed to move a half-step behind her. The gods who had lit that fire would remember for a long time how little good it had done them. What followed, Odin decided alone, without troubling to ask the counsel of the others. He took up Gungnir, the spear that never missed its mark, and cast it out over the assembled host of the Vanir. These were the gods who lived across the border in Vanaheim. They had sent no quarrel to Asgard until Gulveig gave them one to carry. It was the first spear ever thrown by any hand in any of the 9 worlds. The gesture Odin made that morning became, long afterward, the gesture with which every war among mortal men would be opened. None of the men who copied it ever learned where the custom had begun. The fighting that followed was not long remembered for any single deed done in it. It was remembered instead for how evenly it was matched. The Vanir broke through the wall around Asgard more than once. The wall in those years stood newer and thinner than it would later become. The Aesir answered each breach with the same stubbornness that had killed Ymir at the start of everything. Stone dust hung over the breaches for days at a time. Iron rang against iron long after dark. Men in Midgard never saw a single blow struck, yet they spoke afterward of a hammering that came down out of the sky some nights. Neither side gained ground it could hold for long. Neither would admit even to itself how little the fighting was actually deciding. Men and gods both, when the old poets tried afterward to describe that war, fell back on, saying only that it went on. Season folded into season until both sides were too worn down to remember clearly why it had started. Exhaustion did what neither army's weapons could do. It produced at last a peace. The peace was sealed, the way such peaces were always sealed, with an exchange of hostages. Each side kept something of the other's blood close enough to lose if the truce ever broke. The Vanir sent Njord, lord of harbours, to live from then on among the Aesir. He brought his 2 children with him, Freyr and Freyja. Njord still carried the smell of salt water on his clothes when he arrived. The children stood beside him, fair-haired and quiet. They took in a hall built of stone and shield, so unlike the soft green country they had left behind. The Aesir sent back Honir. He was a broad and handsome god who looked to Vanir eyes exactly the way a leader was supposed to look. Beside him they sent Mimir, whose quiet counsel Honir had always leaned on more than anyone in Asgard had openly admitted. Freyja, once settled among her new kin, taught Odin the working of seed herself, patiently and in private. It was from her teaching, far more than from anything Gulveig had scattered loose in that first hall, that Odin learned what he afterward knew. But Honir without Mimir at his shoulder turned out to be no leader at all. Seated in council among the Vanir and asked for his judgment on some dispute, he offered only one reply. "Let others decide," he said, however many times the question was put to him again. The Vanir watched this happen again and again through a whole season of councils. They decided at last that they had been cheated in the trade. They had been handed a handsome empty vessel in return for Njord and his children, who were worth a great deal more to them. Their anger fell on Mimir instead of on Hoenir. They cut off Mimir's head and sent it back across the border to Asgard. No warning came with it and no word of explanation. Odin did not bury what arrived at his door. He took the head and packed it in herbs to keep the flesh from spoiling. Then he sang charms over it until it could speak to him again in something close to its old voice. But the voice, once it returned, spoke slower than it had in life. It was as if the years by the water had gone on without it and had to be caught up first. He kept it afterward beside the well under the second root of the tree, the very well Mimir had once guarded whole. He went to it when he needed counsel no living god could give him. Something in Odin found no discomfort in the arrangement at all. If anything, it suited him. The dead, he had come to believe, kept their secrets more carefully than the living ever had, and would keep them longer still. The hostages changed hands, and tempers on both sides cooled. Then the truce itself was sealed, in a stranger fashion than either side's earlier oaths had been. This time no one swore on iron or on a ring. Every god present, Aesir and Vanir alike, spat instead into a single vat set out for the purpose. What belonged to each side mingled in one vessel, and neither could claim the peace as entirely its own doing. Out of that vat, in time, a being took shape, and he was given the name Kvasir. What became of him belonged to a later part of this telling. For now it was enough that he existed. He was wise already at the moment of his making. He walked out of Asgard into a story that had not yet caught up with him. The peace itself closed the wound between Aesir and Vanir, and restored the roads of trade between their two countries. But it left buried in its trade of hostages a debt that would outlast every god who had signed it. But one thing the war left unmended was the wall itself. The Vanir had broken it in more than one place before the peace was struck. Hostages had newly settled, and a strange wise creature had just walked free of a communal vat. In the relief of the truce, no one in Asgard got around to the stonework. The gods were occupied with hostages and oaths and the sudden wonder of Kvasir. They gave the gap in the wall no more thought than a household gave a loose shingle in fair weather. None of them suspected how soon someone would arrive to notice it for them. The gap stood open through that entire first season of peace. It was wide enough for a laden cart, wide enough for anything at all that cared to walk through it unasked. Beyond the broken stretch of wall lay open grey ground, unwatched and unfenced. It ran off toward the edge of Jotunheim, where nothing yet stood to say who might or might not cross it. Part 5. The builder, not many days after the wall was left standing open, a stranger came riding up to the gap. He rode a grey stallion, and he offered, in plain and unhurried terms, to close it. He gave no name at first. The gods who gathered to hear him out did not press him for one. He was broad through the shoulder, dressed for a long ride. He studied the broken stone with the eye of someone who had raised walls before. He meant exactly what he said about raising this one. His price, when he finally named it, silenced the hall for a long moment. He asked for the sun out of the sky and the moon along with it. He asked for Freya as well, delivered to him as a wife on the day the work was finished. In exchange he promised a wall stronger than the one the Vanir had broken. He would raise it inside of 3 full seasons. Nothing would ever again come through that gap without the god's own leave. The gap itself, in the days before any stone was laid, was a plain sort of ruin. Broken blocks lay in the grass where the Vanir had left them. Old mortar had crumbled to grey dust. A scorched patch showed where a torch had once fallen and burned itself out unattended. The stranger walked the length of it alone before he spoke again. He ran one hand along the cracked top course, the way a shepherd might run a hand along a horse's flank. He was feeling for what could still be trusted to bear weight. The gods might have sent him away outright, and most of them wanted to. Then Loki spoke. It was Loki who worked out the terms that made the bargain look safe to agree to. He proposed not 3 seasons, but a single winter. No help of any kind would go to the builder beyond what his own horse could carry. No man, however strong, could raise a wall of that size alone between one autumn and the following summer. It made no difference what a single animal might haul for him. Loki argued the terms the way he argued most things, with a quickness. The others mistook it for cleverness on their own behalf rather than his. It never once occurred to the gods listening that the terms might have been shaped for Loki's amusement as much as for Asgard's safety. On those terms, and only on those terms, the gods agreed. They swore it among themselves with the same solemnity they swore any oath. Not one of them was yet troubled by how easily Loki had argued them into it. The builder's horse was named Svadilfari, and it proved no ordinary animal. Night after night it hauled stone up to the rising wall. The blocks were larger than any 2 draught horses in Midgard could have dragged between them. The wall climbed course by course, faster than any watching mason could account for. The work went on by torchlight, since the stallion never seemed to tire and the builder never seemed to sleep. Those gods who came out at odd hours to watch found the same picture waiting for them each time. Sparks flew off, struck stone, and breath rose white off the horses' flanks. The wall stood a little taller than it had the night before. Weeks still stood between that night and summer, yet by the dead of winter the wall already stood higher than a spear laid on end. It was thick enough along its top for 3 men to walk abreast. The gods who had thought the bargain a safe joke stopped finding it funny at all. But 3 days before the deadline, with only the gate itself left unbuilt, the gods finally sat down together. They reckoned honestly what they stood to lose. The dread that settled over the hall was sharper for arriving so late, after a whole winter of careless confidence. The sun would go dark, the moon would go with it. Freyjar would be led out of Asgard and given to a builder none of them had ever troubled to name. Not one of them, through that whole easy winter, had believed the impossible might actually be managed. They turned on Loki in the hall, since the bargain had been his making from the first evening. They told him plainly that his own death would answer for it unless the wall was somehow left unfinished. Loki, cornered at last, swore that he would see to it, whatever the cost turned out to be to himself. That same night Svadilfari hauled another load of stone toward the gate. A mare came out of the trees at the edge of the working ground and stood across the stallion's path. She was pale in the dark under the pines, mane loose. She showed no fear of the great grey horse, bearing down on her a full load still strapped behind him. Svadilfari broke his traces at the sight of her, and bolted into the wood. The mare ran always astride ahead of him. She led him further from the wall with every hour that passed, deeper into country where no torch had ever been carried. The stallion did not come back before morning. The stone he had been hauling stayed exactly where it had fallen. Without her horse, the builder could not finish, not that night, not in 3. The gate that would have completed the wall stood open still when the deadline came and went. Robbed of the one thing that had made his work possible, the builder's temper broke along with his bargain. He grew, in front of the gods watching him, into the shape he had been hiding under a man's clothes and a man's mild manner. He was a mountain giant now, huge and raging. Nothing was left of the polite mason who had ridden up to that gap a single season before. The fury in him was not feigned, Something old and long-starved in him had briefly, foolishly believed the bride and the son were already his. But no giant, however large, could stand for long once the gods had stopped debating and started acting. They sent for Thor, who arrived at speed and troubled himself with no question of a bargain broken or kept. Thor swung the hammer once, and the giant's skull came apart under the blow like a dropped pot. Bone and blood scattered across the unfinished stone. The body was carried down afterward into Niflhel, among the other dead who had earned no better ground. Loki did not come back to Asgard for months after that night in the wood. When he finally returned, he came leading a foal behind him, grey and still unsteady on its legs. It carried 8 of them instead of 4. He gave no full account of where the extra legs had come from. No one who looked at him closely cared to press him for one. The foal was named Sleipnir. He grew into the finest horse among gods and men alike, faster over any ground than any animal ever bred or born before him. His 8 legs fell in a rhythm no rider ever fully learned to predict. Odin took him for his own. He rode him from that day on every road between the 9 worlds, over sea and stone, and the trembling span of Bifrost alike. Sleipnir would, long after this part of the story, carry a single rider down through the very gate of hell. That ride belonged to a telling still a long way off. None of the gods spoke afterward of the oath they had broken to save the sun and the moon. A killing in the yard had made the argument feel settled and finished. But an oath sworn and broken in Asgard was never simply forgotten there. The gods had no notion how carefully such debts were kept. It was set down somewhere instead, against a reckoning none of them could yet see. It joined the same ledger that already held the price of an eye and the weight of a severed head. By full summer, the wall stood finished around Asgard, every course of it set true. Only the last stone of the gate still sat loose in its socket. Grass had already begun pushing up green through the cart ruts the stallion had worn into the ground the previous winter. Part 6. The Mead. The wall held, and the seasons went on, turning past it. The gods went back to the ordinary business of their days. The killing in the yard was already fading into something spoken of only in passing. Yet of all the things that had come out of the war and its uneasy peace, none would travel further or end more badly than the being made from the spit of that truce. His name was Kvasir. His story would become the reason Mead was ever afterward called by a poet's name. Kvasir had been shaped from nothing but the mingled spittle of 2 peoples who no longer wished to fight each other. Yet he came into the world wiser than anyone born of flesh had ever been. He went from hall to hall across the 9 worlds, asking for nothing beyond a night's lodging. No question was ever put to him, however strange or however old, that he left unanswered. Farmers asked him why the frost came early some years and late in others. Chieftains asked him how a feud might end without more blood spent on it. He answered each of them plainly and sat by the fire a while longer. He walked on the next morning with nothing carried on his back but the clothes he wore. Word of him spread ahead of him faster than he travelled. Halls he had never visited already knew his name. He came at last to the dwelling of 2 dwarves, Fëlar and Galar. They kept their hall low and windowless, in a fold of rock where little daylight reached. The place smelled of banked coals and wet stone. Along its walls hung the ordinary clutter of dwarf work. Tongs, half-finished blades, coils of drawn wire waiting for a buyer. The two brothers greeted Kvasir with more warmth than any host had shown him in a long while. They told him they wished to speak with him alone, away from the crowd that always gathered wherever he sat down to eat. Kvasir, who had never once in his whole existence been refused an honest question, saw no reason to refuse this one. A lifetime spent answering strangers honestly had left him with no instinct at all for suspecting their motives in return. But the two dwarves had not asked him aside to learn anything from him at all. They led him into an inner chamber and fell on him together. They cut his throat before he had finished settling himself on the bench. They caught every drop of his blood in 2 vats called Son and Bodin. They worked the last of it into a smaller pot named Odrer and mixed the whole of it with honey. It thickened into a mead the colour of dark amber. Whoever drank of that mead, even a single mouthful, would speak thereafter in poetry. Whoever drank enough of it would be able to answer any question at all, exactly as Kvasir had done. Neither brother troubled to wonder whether that was a fair trade for a life. They told the other gods, when asked, that Kvasir had choked on his own wisdom. He had found no one left in all the worlds clever enough to draw it out of him. Nobody who repeated that explanation afterward quite believed it, though for a long while nobody could prove otherwise. But the appetite that had killed Kvasir did not end with him. Jalar and Galar invited a giant named Gilling to go out fishing with them along with his wife. Once the boat was well out from shore, they contrived to capsize it against a hidden rock. Gilling could not swim. He went under within sight of the land he had set out from. The two dwarves rowed back alone and told no one what had happened. Some days after, Gilling's wife came out weeping under the doorway of her hall, asking after her husband. Jalar climbed above the door and dropped a millstone on her head as she passed beneath it. She died there on her own threshold, without ever learning what had become of him. It was done without heat, the same way a man might quiet a dog that had begun to bark too long. The dwarves went back inside afterward and finished their meal. Tung, the giant's son, learnt of both deaths before the season turned. He came for the two brothers with a rage that made no room for argument. He carried them out to a skerry that the tide would drown by evening. There he set them on the bare rock above the rising water. He left them to choose between the flood and whatever price he named for their lives. Jalar and Galar chose the price. It cost them the whole of the mead, every drop of it. It was poured out of Odrir and the 2 vats into Suttung's own keeping. He carried it home to a mountain called Hnitbjorg, a grey shoulder of rock standing apart from any road. There he had a chamber hollowed deep inside it, reached by no door that an ordinary traveller would ever find. There he set his daughter Gunnlod to guard the mead alone for 3 long winters. She had nothing for company but stone walls, and the smell of the honeyed drink sitting untouched in the dark behind her. She would come to know every crack in that ceiling before the 3 winters were done. Odin heard of the mead the way he heard of most things worth hearing. He set out for Jotunheim under a false name, calling himself Baldr. On the road he came upon 9 thralls belonging to a giant named Baugi, Suttung's own brother. They were mowing a hayfield with dull scythes under a hot sky, cursing the blades between strokes. Odin offered to wet them, and drew a stone from inside his cloak. He passed it over the 9 edges until they shone bright enough to cut air. Afterward, The thralls reached for the stone, each wanting the sharpening for himself. Odin threw it into the air above them. In the scramble that followed, every one of the 9 cut his own neighbour's throat. Bogi arrived to find 9 dead men lying in his half-cut hay, and not one blade of grass more mown than before. Bogi, with his harvest ruined and no hands left to work, it took Baldr on in the dead men's place. He was certain no single hired man would manage what 9 had left unfinished. The stranger laboured through the whole of that summer for the wages of 9 ordinary thralls. When the season ended, he asked only one thing, that Bogi win him a single drink of his brother Suttung's mead. Bogi went to Suttung and asked on the stranger's behalf. Dung refused outright. He was unwilling to part with so much as a swallow of what 2 deaths and a drowning had already cost him. Baldr did not argue the refusal. He asked instead for an auger, a tool called rati. He told Baugi to bore a hole clean through the mountain of Hinnitbjorg to the chamber where the mead was kept. But Baugi bored part way and claimed the rock was through, hoping to spare himself the last and hardest length of the labour. Baldr blew into the hole and felt the chips fly back into his own face. That told him plainly the giant was lying. He sent Baugi back to finish it properly. When the auger broke through at last, the chips blew inward instead of out. Baldr turned himself into a snake and slid through the narrow bore. Bogi, too slow and too late, struck at the hole behind him with a useless auger still in his hand. Inside the mountain, Gunnlod sat alone with the 3 vessels she had guarded through 3 winters without company and without relief. Baldr put off the snake's shape and came to her as a man. He stayed with her 3 nights. On each of those nights she granted him 1 draught from the mead in exchange for his company in the dark chamber. On the first night he drank the whole of Odr in a single swallow. On the second he emptied Bodn the same way. On the third he drained Sun to its last drop. All 3 vessels, winters of Suttung's careful hoarding, were empty inside of 3 swallows, taken on 3 separate nights. Gunnlod wept when she understood what the emptied vats meant and what her own 3 nights had cost her. By then there was nothing left in the mountain to weep over, but the taste still on her own lips. Odin took the shape of an eagle and flew for the mouth of the mountain with the mead carried inside him. Wingbeats hammered against the cold air of the peak, but Suttung was warned too late by Baugi's shouting. He took eagle shape himself, and came after in a fury that closed the gap between them with every stroke of his wings. The gods, watching from the walls of Asgard, saw the 2 birds racing toward them across the sky. They set out every vat and bowl they owned along the ground of the yard. When Odin came down over the wall at last, he could spit the mead into vessel after vessel without breaking his flight. In his haste and his terror of Suttung's beak so close behind him, a little of it spilled backward. It fell to earth outside the wall. That small portion was left for anyone who cared to drink it and called himself a poet. The gods kept the greater share for whoever they judged worthy of it. Tung cheated a second time, and this time for good, turned back for Jotunheim. He had nothing to show for the chase. All he had was the sight of his own mead vanishing over a wall he could not cross. Inside Nitbjorg the mountain closed again behind him. It was dark and silent. As it had been before, Bolverk's hole was ever bored through it. In the hollow chamber at its heart, Gunnlod sat alone in the black beside 3 empty vessels that would never again be filled. Part 7. The 6 gifts inside the mountain of Nithbjorg, the dark stayed sealed. Out in Asgard, the mead was already being poured into new vessels, and the ordinary business of the gods went on. Sif woke one morning to find her hair gone. It had been cut away in the night down to the scalp while she slept, every last strand of it swept up and carried off. No one in the hall had heard so much as a footstep on the boards. She sat a long while with her hand pressed flat against her own bare skull. Only then could she bring herself to walk out and be seen by anyone. Thor knew before he was told twice whose idea of amusement this had to have been. Mischief of exactly that shape had Loki's hand in it more often than not. By mid-morning he had Loki by the throat against a post of the hall. He promised to break every bone in his body one at a time, starting with the smallest. That would happen unless the hair came back exactly as it had been. Loki, choking and in no position to argue terms, swore he would go down to Svartalfheim. There he would have the dwarves make Sif hair of pure gold. That hair would take root and grow on her scalp exactly as her own had done. Thor loosened his grip only when the oath was sworn twice over. Loki, once free of it, rubbed his throat. He found he rather liked the idea of coming back with a good deal more than he had been asked to fetch. Svartalfheim lay under the roots of the world, in tunnels that never saw daylight. Low-roofed passages were cut through black stone, lit only by the glow of forge coals banked in pits along the walls. The air down there sat thick and close, heavy with the smell of hot iron and scorched hair. There was a sour smell, too, of quenching water thrown again and again over red metal. Bins of raw ore stood stacked along every passage. Coils of drawn wire hung from iron hooks beside half-finished blades still waiting for a hilt. Hammering came from every direction at once, some near and some so far off it reached the ear as no more than a tremor underfoot. It never once stopped, the whole time Loki walked those tunnels. Day and night meant nothing down there, where no sun ever reached. Small figures passed him in the low corridors without a glance, bent under loads of charcoal or coiled chain. None of them paused long enough to be greeted. He found first the sons of Ivaldi, a pair of dwarf brothers already famous for the thinness of their work. He set them to the task. They made 3 things. The first was the hair itself, drawn out into threads finer than any spider's work. It was struck so true that it took root on Sif's head the moment it touched her. From then on it grew like any woman's hair, gold from root to tip, and warm to the touch as living hair was warm. The second was a ship called Skidbladnir, its planks fitted so close no seam showed daylight. It was built to catch a fair wind the instant its sail was raised, no matter which way that wind was blowing. It could also be folded down small enough to carry in a pouch when no sea was wanted. The third was a spear, and this one needed no new introduction. It was Gungnir itself, the spear that never missed its mark, and by which the gravest oaths in Asgard were sworn. But Loki was pleased with what he already carried, and never able to leave well enough alone. He wagered his own head with 2 other dwarfs, brothers named Brokkr and Eitri. He wagered that they could not better the sons of Ivaldi's work. Eitri set a pigskin in the forge fire. He told his brother Brokkr to work the bellows without ever once letting the fire die, whatever happened. Then he left the room. Loki was uneasy at the thought of losing the wager, and his own neck along with it. He turned himself into a fly and settled on Brokkr's arm, biting down hard enough to draw blood. Brokkr did not so much as pause, Out of that fire came a boar with bristles of gold named Gullinbursti. It could outrun any horse across land, open sea, or empty air. It could light the darkest night for a mile around with the glow off its own back. Yggdrasil set gold in the fire next and told Brokkr the same as before, and left again. Loki, as the fly, bit down twice as hard on the back of Brokkr's neck this time. He was certain that pain enough would break even a dwarf's patience. But Brokkr only set his jaw and kept the bellows moving, and the fire never once dipped. Out of that fire came a ring named Draupnir, slender and plain to look at. Every 9th night it dripped 8 new rings of its own weight from itself. A single ring left, lying in a chest, would be a small hoard within a season. Yggdrasil set iron in the fire a 3rd time. He told Brokkr once more not to let the bellows fail no matter what came, and left the room a final time. This time Loki was desperate, with the wager closing in on him and his own head hanging on the outcome. He turned into a fly far larger than before, and settled directly on Brokkr's eyelid. He bit down until the blood ran into his eye and blinded him on that side. Brokkr's hand came up, just once, just long enough to wipe the blood away, and in that one instant the fire dipped. When Yggdrasil drew the iron out, it was a hammer, short in the handle. It was shorter than it should have been, by the width of 2 fingers. There was no putting that fault right, once the metal had cooled. Everything else about it was without flaw, and Yggdrasil knew it even as he cursed the shortened half. Brokkr named it Mjolnir. The 2 dwarves carried all 6 gifts up to Asgard and set them out on a long bench before Odin, Thor, and Freyr. The 3 would judge which pair had made the finer things. Odin was given the spear and the ring, turning each over in his one good eye without comment. Freyr was given the boar and the folding ship. He folded the ship down into its pouch and back out again twice before he set it aside, satisfied. Thor was given the golden hair for Sif and the short-handled hammer. It was Thor's gifts. The 3 judges weighed last and longest. They passed the hammer hand to hand, testing its balance against the shortness of its grip. In the end, they named the hammer the best thing made that day, better than the spear and better than the ring. That was because of the serpent that lay coiled somewhere out past the sight of any god in that hall. It was a threat spoken of only in the fewest words, and left there unexplained. None of the 3 judges said more about it than that. Each of them understood exactly what the words meant and let the matter drop. Brokkr, the judgment given, turned to Loki and asked for the head that had been wagered. Every god present agreed the wager had been fair and must be honoured. But Loki, quick as always, even with his own neck on the line, pointed out that his head might be forfeit. His neck, though, had never once been named in the bargain. No cut could be made without touching the neck to get at it. The dwarves had no answer to that argument, turned as neatly against them as any blade. No god in the hall was willing to press the point in Loki's favour, a moment longer than the law strictly required. Brokkr was left with a wager he could not collect, and a grievance he intended to settle some other way before the day was out. He took an awl called Vingul, and a leather thong named Vartari. Though he could not take the head, he sewed Loki's lips shut with them there in front of everyone. He drew the awl through again and again. Loki thrashed and could make no sound beyond what came muffled through a closing mouth. Blood ran down over his chin and dried there before anyone thought to wipe it away. Loki tore the thong loose himself some time after, the marks it left in his skin never fully healed. Gods who looked closely at his mouth in later years would still find the old scars crossing it. The hammer went to Thor's own hall at Thrudvangar and was laid out on a long table there. Its handle was 2 fingers' width, too short for any craftsman ever to lengthen. Its head was plain iron without ornament of any kind, dull under the torchlight. A finer weapon would have caught the flame there and thrown it back. Beside it were set the 2 things that let a mortal-sized grip close safely around that shortened haft at all. There was a pair of iron gloves, scarred already from gripping metal, too hot to touch bare-handed. There was also a belt of strength that doubled whatever force the wearer already carried in his arms. No one in the hall that evening would have guessed how soon all 3 would be needed. Hammer, gloves, and belt together were meant for something considerably larger than a dwarf's forge fire. Part 8. The children of Angrboda. The hammer stayed on its table at Thrudvangar, gloves and belt beside it. For a while, Asgard's business went on quietly enough that even Loki's scarred mouth drew fewer glances than it had at first. He had a wife in Asgard by then, a goddess named Sigyn, and 2 young sons by her, Nafi and Vali. The household the 3 of them kept looked, from the outside, ordinary enough not to remark on. What Loki kept from that household, and from Sigyn most of all, was a second family entirely. It had been got in secret, in a country a long way from any hall. In a cave in Jotunheim, over the course of 3 winters, Loki fathered 3 children on a giantess named Angrboda. Her name meant she who brings grief. There was nothing about any of the 3 that made the name feel poorly chosen. The eldest was a wolf cub from birth, small enough at first to be carried in one hand. The second was a serpent, no longer than a finger when it left its mother, gliding rather than crawling even then. The third was a daughter, and she alone kept a human shape. Half of her, from the crown of her head down to her waist, was living flesh, coloured like any woman's skin. The other half, from the waist down, had already gone the black and blue of a 3-day corpse. Odin could see further than any god in Asgard, and further than he ever wished to. He learned of the 3 children before they were fully grown. He sent for word of what would come of them. What came back was a prophecy that named each child in turn for the harm it would eventually do. It was harm that no amount of watching or feeding or careful handling would prevent forever. The wolf would grow beyond any cage built to hold an ordinary beast. The serpent would grow beyond any sea built to hold an ordinary fish. The daughter would rule over something that had not yet been given a name. No one had needed such a name until she was born to fill it. Odin acted on the prophecy at once before the children could grow any larger in their mother's keeping. He sent for the serpent first and flung it, small as it still was. Down it went into the ocean that ran around the whole of Midgard. But it did not die, though anyone sensible might have expected exactly that of so young a creature thrown into so vast a sea. It grew instead, year upon year, feeding on whatever the deep water gave it. In time, its body ran the entire circumference of Midgard, and its jaws closed at last around the base of its own tail. The world sat afterward inside a living ring that never once let go of itself. Men who came to call it Jormungandr, the world's serpent, never learned this from any sighting Almost none of them ever saw more than a wake on open water, where something enormous had passed beneath the surface. The daughter, called Hel, Odin dealt with differently. He cast her not into the sea, but down into the lowest of the 9 worlds. There he set her to rule over whatever died of sickness or old age rather than in battle. Hall was named Eljudnir. Its furnishings were named with the same flat, grim honesty as everything else about her. That held true whenever anyone spoke of them at all. Her dish was called hunger, her knife was called famine. Her threshold was a plank named stumbling block, laid so that anyone crossing it stumbled whether they meant to or not. Her bed was called sick bed. The hangings drawn around it were named glimmering misfortune. Governed all of that in silence, her corpse blue half and her living half sitting equally still on the same throne. No one who was sent down to her afterward ever came back to describe the rest of it firsthand. The wolf cub, Fenrir, was the one child of the 3 the gods chose not to cast out. They judged that raising him inside Asgard, where he could be watched daily, was safer than leaving him to grow unseen. A cave in Jotunheim was no place for that. Only Tyr, among all the gods, was willing to go near enough to feed him with his own hand. But Fenrir did not stay a cub for long. He grew visibly from one week to the next. He was broader in the chest and longer in the jaw. Each time the gods looked at him. In time, the growing itself became a thing nobody in Asgard cared to mention out loud anymore. It was the way a household stopped remarking on a leak, once the whole floor had already gone soft with it. The gods resolved at last to bind him, and had a chain forged called lading. It was thick enough that no ordinary beast alive could have hoped to break it. They brought it to Fenrir as a game, and told him it was a test of his own strength. He let them fasten it around him without much resistance, curious more than wary. He shattered it with a single kick, the moment they stepped back to admire their work. The pieces of lading lay scattered across the ground. The wolf's reputation, rather than his fear, grew larger for the breaking of it. A second chain followed, named Dromi, twice the thickness of the first and forged with twice the care. The gods told Fenrir again that breaking it would bring him great fame among them. That played to a pride he was already old enough to feel. He allowed himself to be bound a second time, strained once, strained again. But on the third effort he snapped Dromi as easily as the first. Both failed chains only added to the wolf's growing name rather than diminishing it. Word of the wolf that could not be held travelled through every one of the 9 worlds by then. The gods were badly frightened, though few of them said so plainly. They sent a messenger named Skirnir down into Svartalfheim to ask the dwarves there for something no chain of ordinary metal could ever equal. The dwarves made what was asked of them out of 6 things that did not strictly exist to be gathered. 3 of them were the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard grown on a woman's chin, and the roots that held up a mountain. The other 3 were the sinews inside a bear, the breath drawn by a fish underwater, and the spittle of a bird. Out of those 6 impossibilities they wove a ribbon named Gleipnir. It was slim as a strip of silk, and soft to the touch as one. It had no more apparent strength in it than the length of ordinary cloth. It was for exactly that reason, so the dwarves said, none of the 6 things it was made from could ever be found in the world again. Each one had been used up entirely in the weaving of it. The gods carried Gleipnir out to a low island in a lake called Amsvartnir an island named Lyngvi. They told Fenrir it was only a slender ribbon, nothing worth the trouble of straining against. It was hardly a true test of his strength at all. But Fenrir was grown wary at last, after 2 broken chains. He eyed the soft ribbon with more suspicion than he had shown either chain before it. He said he would agree to be bound only if one god first laid a hand in his mouth. It would be a pledge that no trickery was meant by it. The gods looked from one to another. It was a silence that went on a good deal longer than any of them wanted. Alone among them had fed the wolf with his own hand, since it was a cub small enough to carry. He stepped forward and laid his right hand between Fenrir's jaws. The other gods bound him, then wrapping Gleipnir around his legs and body, while Tyr's hand stayed where it was. Fenrir strained against the ribbon, the way he had strained against Lading and against Dromi. The harder he strained, the tighter Gleipnir drew. It was plain to every god watching that this binding, unlike the first 2, would not break. The laughter that had gone round the circle at the wolf's expense stopped all at once. Fenrir closed his jaws with the full force of his growing strength. Tyr's hand came away at the wrist, clean and sudden. The wolf thrashed and howled against a ribbon that gave him nothing at all to break. The gods, done with the binding, took the end of Gleipnir and threaded it through a boulder called Giol. They drove that down deep into the earth. Then they took a second great rock, a slab called Viti. They sank it deeper still to hold the first in place. Fenrir's own jaws, snapping and raging, even then were propped open with a sword set upright between them. Its hilt was against his lower jaw, and its point against the roof of his mouth. He could neither close his teeth again nor swallow. The foam that ran endlessly from his open jaws afterward gathered into a river the giants called Van. It ran out from that island for as long as the wolf lay bound there. Not one god in that circle had wanted to kill him outright, whatever the cost of leaving him living. The ground of Asgard was held to be too sacred a place for that. No blood of any prisoner taken there, wolf or otherwise, was to stain it. The mercy shown that morning would one day cost the All-Father his own life, and not merely a single hand. Unaware of that, the gods walked back from Lyngvi, satisfied that the danger had been settled for good. Out on Lyngvi, the boulder Giol sat, sunk in the earth, with the slab Taviti driven down beside it. Around the wolf's throat and legs the ribbon Gleipnir lay, drawn taut and pale. It caught what little light reached that island, the way rime caught the first low sun of a winter morning. Part 9, the apples. Out past Lyngvi, the wolf lay bound and foaming. Asgard's business went back, on the surface at least, to its ordinary run of days. What kept that surface calm more than any wall or any chained beast ever had was a plain wooden box kept by a goddess named Idun. The story of what nearly happened to it would become the closest the gods themselves ever came to losing everything. Not a single blow was ever struck against them. Idun's box was made of ash, unremarkable to look at. It was worn smooth along its edges from handling inside it. She kept apples that never went soft and never once ran short. It made no difference how many hands reached into the box, across how many centuries. Whoever ate of them stayed as they already were, unbent by years, their hair its own colour. Their grip stayed strong enough to close a fist around a sword hilt without complaint. It was a plain fact among the gods, stated without ceremony, the way a man might state the price of bread. Without those apples, every one of them would age exactly as any mortal aged. Eventually every one of them would die of it. But that quiet arrangement nearly ended on a journey that began ordinarily enough. Odin, Loki, and Ymir set out together across a stretch of barren upland country. They were hungry after days on the road, with nothing but dry provisions between them. They came upon a herd of oxen grazing in a valley. They killed one and built up a fire to roast it, certain of a proper meal before nightfall. But the meat would not cook. They turned it and fed the fire and waited and turned it again. They watched raw flesh sit unchanged over flame that should have cooked it through twice over. After a long while of that, a voice spoke from the branches of an oak standing over the fire. An eagle was perched there, larger than any bird the three gods had ever seen alive. The eagle told them plainly that it had been holding back the fire's heat from the meat. It offered to let the ox cook after all on one condition. It would be given its own full share of the meal once the roasting was finally done. Hungry enough by then to agree to almost anything, the three gods consented. The ox cooked through at once, steam rising off it in the cold air. But when the eagle dropped down to take its portion, it seized both hindquarters and both shoulders together. It took no fair fourth share. It left barely a few scraps of gristle for the three gods to divide between them. Loki, furious at the theft and hungrier than he was willing to admit, snatched up a long pole. He struck at the eagle with the whole of his strength behind the blow. The pole did not glance off. One end of it drove into the bird's body and stuck there fast. The other end stayed gripped in Loki's own two hands. The eagle beat its wings and rose off the ground. It carried Loki with it, dragged along behind at the end of the pole with no way to let go. He was hauled low over broken ground the whole distance. Stones opened the skin along both arms, and thickets tore at his face and chest. The strain of it pulled both his shoulders near out of their sockets. Only then did the eagle finally slow. Loki did not soften what came next by asking politely. He begged in plain and desperate terms for the bird to set him down. He wanted his arms spared any further tearing. The eagle was no true bird at all, but the giant Tazi wearing a borrowed shape. Hazi set the terms of Loki's release without hurry. He knew exactly how little choice the god dangling from his own pole actually had. His price was Idun, delivered out of Asgard within a matter of days. He wanted the ash box too, and every apple inside it. Loki, arms burning and skin scraped raw down to the meat in places, swore the oath there in the open air with Tazi still gripping the pole. Only then was he let down, bruised and bloodied. He walked the rest of the way home with Odin and Ymir. True to what he had sworn in the open air, Loki would keep the oath within the week. He went to Idun and told her he had found a stand of apples growing wild, not far outside the walls of Asgard. They matched her own for shape and colour, he said. He suggested she bring her own box along to compare the two kinds side by side. No reason to doubt him. She walked out through the gate with the ash box under one arm. The moment she cleared the wall, Thazi came down out of the sky in his eagle shape. He closed his talons around her. He carried her and the box both away to his hall at Thrymheim, high and cold above the tree line. What followed inside Asgard's walls happened slowly. At first almost no one remarked on it. Grey crept into beards that had shown no grey the season before. Hands that had once closed easily around a sword hilt or a drinking horn began to fumble the grip and let it slip. The great hall had rung most evenings with talk and the scrape of benches. Now it grew quiet by stages. Standing up from a seat had become a task that cost something real. These were gods who had never once in their long lives needed to think about the effort of it. Faces that had never carried a line now carried several. The light in more than one pair of eyes had gone the dull colour of ash left too long in a cold hearth. Left much longer without the apples. More than one god in that hall would not have lived to see the matter settled. It was Loki's own absence, more than anything spoken aloud, that finally told the gathered gods where to lay the blame. They seized him the moment he was found. They dragged him before them to answer for it. Loki confessed without much resistance, since there was very little left to deny by then. He offered at once to go after Idun himself, if Freyja would lend him her cloak of falcon feathers. Freyja agreed. Loki flew north in that shape, feathers close and eyes sharp. He found Thrymheim's hall and Idun shut inside it, Tuzi away at sea in his boat. He turned her into a knot, small enough that a falcon's claw would close whole around it. He beat back south for Asgard as fast as wings could carry him. He held the whole weight of what he carried tight against his own breast. Tazi came home to an empty hall and took to his eagle shape at once. He gained on the falcon mile after mile across open sky. He closed the distance so steadily that by the time Asgard's wall came into sight below them, the two birds were separated by no more than the length of a spear. The gods watched the chase from the wall. They built a great pile of wood shavings there and set it alight the instant the falcon cleared the top of it. Asi, coming in low and fast, just behind, could not check his flight in time. He went straight into the flames, feathers catching at once. He fell burning inside the wall of Asgard, where the gods themselves finished what the fire had begun. Skadi, Tazi's daughter, came to Asgard soon after, in a coat of mail with a spear in her hand and a helmet on her head. She came demanding Wergild for her father's death. She would not accept it in silence, as some lesser house might have. The gods were unwilling to fight a war over one dead giant when a settlement could be reached instead. They offered her 3 things: laughter, however it might be won from her, a husband chosen from among the gods, picked by his feet alone, with nothing else of him seen above the ankle, and whatever further repayment the gods thought fitting, almost an afterthought once the rest was set. She walked the line of feet presented to her and chose the fairest pair. She was certain, from their shape alone, that she had chosen Baldr, but the feet belonged to Njord, lord of harbours and safe passage over open water, not the god she had hoped for. She was married to him with no further argument allowed on the matter. The laughter proved harder to win than the husband had. Loki tied one end of a rope around the beard of a goat. He tied the other end around a part of his own body better left undescribed. The two of them hauled back and forth, shrieking in turn, until Loki finally toppled into Skadi's own lap. She laughed then, in spite of herself, in spite of everything she had come to Asgard, still grieving. It was a short, hard laugh, and it surprised her more than it surprised anyone watching. Odin, to close the settlement out properly, took Shazi's eyes from where the body had fallen. He threw them up into the night sky. There they still burned afterward as 2 fixed stars low over the northern dark. But the marriage to Njord did not survive very long. once the wedding itself was behind them. He kept his hall at Notun, down where the tide came and went. Gulls cried without pause there from first light onward. She could not sleep through that noise, and lay awake for 9 whole nights running, driven half mad by it. They tried it the other way after that. 9 nights at Thrymheim in Skadi's own cold country. Njord fared no better among the wolves that howled there. The whole length of every one of those 9 nights, he was kept from a single hour of rest. Neither of them could live in the other's country. Neither would give up their own for the other's sake. A marriage begun in Wergild would end the same way it had started, in a settlement rather than in love. Skadi went back to Thrymheim alone after that, to the high country her father had ruled before her. She took each morning to a hunting bow and a pair of skis, rather than to any husband's hall. On a bright cold morning not long after her return, she stood alone on her skis in the high snow above Thrymheim. The drifts lay deep and unmarked all around her. Far below, past ridge after ridge of stone and pine, lay the sea she had never once learned to bear. Part 10. The sword given away. High above Thrymheim the snow lay deep enough to swallow a spear standing upright. The wind up there had not eased in longer than anyone kept count. Down where the land dropped toward the sea, and the frost let go of the fields, the world answered to warmer names. Vanaheim lay soft and low, threaded with harbours and slow brown rivers. Nets dried on poles along the shingle, and boats stood drawn up above the tide line. It was from that gentler country that 3 of the gods had come to live among the Aesir. They had been sent north long before, as the price of an old peace. The cold they had left behind them in the mountains seemed from that low green ground to belong to another age of the world entirely. Njord was the eldest of the 3. The sea itself seemed easier for his being alive in it. He kept his hall at Notun, close enough to the tide line that gulls walked its threshold. He was said to grant fair wind to any sailor who asked him plainly and without greed. His son Freyr ruled Alfheim, given to him for a tooth gift in his cradle. It was Freyr who governed the rain and the sun and whatever grew green out of the ground. Where he rode, the barley answered him. His sister Freyja wore brisingamen at her throat, a collar of gold worked by dwarf hands. It seemed to hold its own light after the torches were put out. 2 grey cats drew her wagon wherever she travelled. A cloak of falcon feathers hung folded in her hall, for the day she chose to fly rather than ride. She had married a man named Odin, who went away from her for reasons the old poems never gave. She wept for him still. What fell from her eyes when she wept was not water, but red gold. Hall in Folkvanger was called Sesrumnir, wide enough to seat 900. Its benches were laid with bridal cloth, though no wedding had been held there in an age. But no gold in that hall had ever once brought Ode back through the door. It made no difference how much of it dripped from her lashes on a bad night. But Freyr, for all that the growing earth obeyed him, was not above trying a seat that was not his to sit in. Litskjalf stood empty one afternoon while Odin was elsewhere about the 9 worlds. Freyr climbed into it, though the high seat had been forbidden to every god but its owner. From it, the whole of creation could be seen at once. Every roof and river of all 9 worlds lay below like a cloth unfolded. He looked north, toward Jotunheim, out of nothing more than idle curiosity. In a fenced yard below him, a door opened. A woman crossed the yard to close it again. Her name was Gerd, daughter of the giant Ymir. When she lifted her arms to the door, the light came off them and struck the sea and the sky both. For a moment the whole of the north seemed lit from her hands alone. Ymir's steading stood close by open water, salt on every plank of the fence around it. Gerd's own arms had never before been remarked on by anyone who mattered enough to be repeated. Freyr went back to his own hall that evening and said nothing to anyone. He ate nothing and drank nothing. He spoke to no one who came near him. Something in him had gone quiet and hard. It was as though the sight of her had shut a door inside him that no one else could find the handle to. Njord grew afraid for his son and sent for Skirnir. Skirnir had served Freyr since boyhood and knew his moods better than his own kin did. He went to Freyr and got the whole account out of him, plainly, the way a wound was best looked at in daylight. He agreed to ride into Jotunheim and ask for the woman on Freyr's behalf. But he named his price before he left the hall. He named the sword that fought giants of its own accord as his price, the blade that swung itself in a hand worthy of it. Freyr wanted nothing in the world more than an answer from Gerd. He gave up the sword without much argument. Skirnir rode Freyr's own horse into a country walled with fire and leaping flame. Neither horse nor rider was burned by it. He came to Ymir's steading and found dogs chained at the gate, loud enough to be heard the length of the yard. A herdsman sat on a mound of turf nearby. He told Skirnir plainly that no one came to speak with Gerd and lived to boast of it afterward. But Skirnir had ridden through far to reach that gate. A chained dog and a gloomy herdsman did not turn him back from it. He rode through the gate and asked for her by name. She came out to him at last, weary, wrapped in wool against a wind that seemed to trouble no one else standing in that yard. He offered her 11 apples of red gold first. She said she wanted none of them, since her father's hall held gold enough already. He offered the ring Draupnir next, the one that dripped 8 of its own kind every 9th night. She refused that too, saying her father's wealth needed no adding to. He named the sword last. He told her plainly what its edge would do to her kin, should Freyr come looking for her himself. Still she would not be moved by threat, any more than she had been moved by gift. So Skirnir changed his offer a 3rd time. This time it was no offer at all. He cut runes into a wand and named them one by one. The Thur's rune came first for torment. Beside it he cut 2 more for madness and for a longing that would never once be answered. He told her she would sit alone under an eagle's claw each morning for the rest of her days, fed on nothing. She was to be married to a 3-headed frost giant if she was married to anything at all. Worse than any of that, she faced life unwanted, unloved, and known in every world as the woman who refused. He spoke it evenly, the way a man reads out a debt owed to him. Gerd's face changed before he had finished speaking. The fear that moved across it was not fear of the wand alone. It was fear of the years it promised her, each one longer and colder than the last. Those years stretched away like the frost country she had been born into. She poured mead for him then, in a cup of clear glass. She said she had never thought to give her love to one of the Van Kin at all, and yet she would come. 9 nights from that day, she told him, she would meet Freyr in a grove called Barry, quiet and green and screened from every wind that troubled the rest of that country. Skirnir rode home with the answer and nothing else, since the sword had already changed hands for good. Freya met him at the gate before he had fully dismounted. He asked after her before, he asked after anything. "One night is long," Freya said, "and a second longer still. How shall I bear 3, when 9 stand between this hour and Barry?" Skirnir told him plainly that the 9 would pass every span of nights before it had passed the same way. He said the grove would still stand green when he reached it at last. It was not much comfort. Freya did not pretend that it was. He counted the nights on his fingers more than once that week, the way a smaller man might have counted coins he feared were short. The 9 nights did pass. Freya came to Barry and found Gerd waiting exactly as she had promised. The meeting itself was kept short by everyone who told the tale afterward. It was out of a kind of respect. Neither owed the other before that night. But the sword he had traded for her was gone from his hip for good. It had been carried off into Skirnir's keeping, and out of the story entirely. On the last morning the world would ever see, Freya would face Surtur's burning blade with nothing at all in his hand to answer it. Barry stood windless that night, the grove holding its quiet the way it always had. Where the sword should have hung at Freya's side, there was only an empty scabbard swinging loose and light against his thigh. Part 11. Thor, Freya's grove, stood quiet again within the season. The tale that followed him left him there, married and mostly content, while it turned to a louder household entirely. Of all the halls raised in Asgard, none was larger than Skirnir. None belonged to a god who cared for its size less. Skirnir held 540 rooms under one roof, more than any hall raised before or after it. Thor kept the whole vast structure for himself and his household, without ever once troubling to count the rooms he did not use. Torchlight ran the length of its main hall on both sides. Smoke from its hearths climbed straight through vents cut for the purpose. The roof beams above the high seat stayed black with 100 winters of soot. Mead benches ran the walls, though Thor filled few of them himself. He preferred, more often than not, the open road and the company of whichever giant had lately offended him. His wife Sif sat combing hair of spun gold in the long room nearest the door. It grew from her scalp exactly as any other woman's did, fine and heavy and worth more than the room around her. Thor's belt hung on its peg by the hearth, and it was called Meggingjord. Beside it hung the pair of iron gloves. In the yard outside 2 goats grazed within a low stone wall, Tangrisnir and Tangiostra. They pulled the chariot in which Thor rode out across the sky, so that thunder followed wherever the wheels went that day. When Thor travelled by road instead of by chariot, he sometimes killed the goats for meat. He spread their skins out by the fire to catch the bones. Both animals rose whole again by morning, if no bone had been broken or lost along the way. Once in the house of a poor farmer, the farmer's son split open a thigh bone for the marrow inside it. He could not resist the smell of it. By morning 1 goat had come up lame in its hind leg. Thor's anger filled the small house like smoke filling a room with the door shut. The farmer, in terror of him, gave up his son and his daughter both to serve out the debt. The boy was Tayafi and the girl was Roskva. They went with Thor from that morning onward, and never went home again. Something in Thjalfi never fully forgave himself for the broken bone. It was that old debt, more than fear of Thor, that kept him running at the wheels of the chariot. He ran without complaint through every road that followed, but peace in Asgard rarely held through a single autumn. That year it broke over a horse race. Hrungnir, greatest of the frost giants, sat mounted on Golfaxi, the finest horse anyone there had seen outside the god's own stables. Odin rode past him on Sleipnir and mocked the animal's speed. Hrungnir gave chase without thinking. Before he could rein the horse in, he found himself inside the gates of Asgard itself. The gods, rather than turn a guest out by force, poured for him in Valhalla. He drank from Thor's own cups until the mead had climbed all the way into his voice. He swore he would carry the whole hall off to Jotunheim, stone by stone, and sink Asgard under the sea. He swore he would kill every god in it but Freyja and Sif, whom he meant to keep for himself. The gods sent word to Thor before the giant had finished his boasting. Thor arrived with the hammer already in his fist. Only the law of hosting kept him from killing Hrungnir on the spot, since a guest could not be murdered under another god's roof. A duel was set instead at Ginnungagap, on ground the giants themselves chose for it. Ginnungagap was bare, wind-scoured ground, with grey scree underfoot the whole way to the horizon. No tree stood anywhere to break the line of sight between the two champions when the day came. Word of the challenge ran through Jotunheim. The giants feared what Hrungnir's death would mean for all of them. They feared what Thor would do next, once he had tasted one giant's blood. So they built a second champion out of clay to stand beside him. It stood 9 leagues high and 3 broad, with a mare's heart set inside it for want of anything better. No giant heart offered to the builders had been large enough to fill it. But by the time Thor's chariot could be heard on the road, thunder rolling ahead of the wheels across that open ground, the clay giant had already begun to sweat. It was a fear it had no true right to feel. Jalfi ran ahead of his master and called out to Hrungnir. He said Thor meant to come up out of the ground rather than across it. Any shield held flat before the chest would do him no good at all. Hrungnir believed the boy. He stood his stone shield beneath his own feet instead, and waited on it with his whetstone raised in both hands. When Thor came on in earnest, lightning ahead of him and thunder behind, Hrungnir threw the whetstone with his whole strength. Thor threw Mjolnir to meet it in the air. Stone struck iron somewhere above the ground between them. The whetstone broke apart, and a great piece of it drove into Thor's skull and lodged there for good. The rest of it fell as gravel over the field for 109 paces in every direction. Mjolnir did not slow for the meeting. It went on into Hrungnir's skull and split it in 3 places. The giant fell forward across Thor's own body, one huge leg landing over his neck and pinning him flat to the earth. Every god who came to lift the leg away failed at it. It stayed where it had fallen, while Thor lay beneath it, until his son Magni came. Magni, only 3 winters old, walked up and lifted the leg clear with one hand, as though it weighed nothing at all. Thor got to his feet and thanked the boy. He said he would make him a gift of Gulfaxi. Odin stood near. He remarked that so fine a horse ought by right to have gone to a father rather than to a son got on a giantess. Thor gave the horse to Magni anyway. The stone stayed lodged in Thor's head afterward. No physician among the gods could work it loose. By any means they tried. But pain of that kind would not be borne forever without some remedy sought. He went at last to Groa, a seeress skilled in charms. He sat by her hearth while she sang over the wound, until the stone began very slowly to shift within it. Her charms were old ones, learned from her mother before her, sung low and even. They were the kind that would loosen frost from a hinge or a splinter from under a nail, if given time enough. Wanting to reward her for the work, Thor told her something. He had once carried her own husband Orvandil out of Jotunheim inside an iron basket. One of the man's toes had frozen and broken off on that crossing. Thor had thrown it up into the sky and made a star of it, a light men still called Orvandil's toe. Groa's joy at the news was so complete that she forgot the rest of her charms entirely. The stone in Thor's skull never worked loose again for as long as he lived. It stayed there the whole of his life afterward, a sliver of grey stone lodged behind his brow. Men said ever after that it was ill luck to throw a wet stone across a floor. The loose chips in the air, they said, still remembered the wound that had made one of them famous. But Thor himself would rarely speak of the stone again, and no one in Bilskirnir thought it wise to ask him about it twice. Over Jotunheim, in the deep of winter, a single bright star kept its place among the others, small and cold and constant. It was Orvandil's frozen toe, still burning there long after the iron basket that had carried it home was forgotten by everyone but Thor. Part 12, Utgard. Not long after the whetstone had settled into Thor's skull for good, he set out again toward the greatest of the giants' countries. He took Loki with him for company, and Talfi and Roskva to serve them on the road. The boy's feet were faster than any man's living. The wood that day had no end that any of them could see. Oak crowded oak until the light coming down through the leaves went thin and green. It was full dark before they found any shelter at all. What they found was a hall unlike any built by men. It had one great room and a smaller chamber opening off one side of it. The doorway ran the whole width of the building, with no door hung in it anywhere. They ate what they carried and lay down in the dark. Near midnight the ground itself began to shudder. A roaring came out of the wood, loud enough to shake the walls around them. Thor stood at the doorway the rest of the night with a hammer in his fist. The others crowded into the narrow side chamber, and none of them slept at all before morning came. When light came back, they found the noise close by. A giant lay asleep against a boulder not far from the hall, breathing so heavily that the ground answered it. Beside him on the grass lay the very building they had sheltered in. It was in fact one enormous glove, the narrow side chamber no more than its thumb. The giant woke, named himself Skrymir, and offered to travel beside them, since their roads ran the same direction for a while yet. He tied their provisions into one bag and slung it over his own shoulder. He said he would carry the weight so that they need not. But that night Thor tried to open the bag for supper. He could not work the wire binding it loose, no matter how hard he pulled at the knots. He went to his bed, hungry and short-tempered under Skrymir's snoring. Skrymir slept against an oak with his mouth open. The noise coming out of him was worse than the roaring of the night before. Thor rose once and struck him full on the head with Mjolnir, certain the blow would kill him outright. Skrymir stirred and asked whether a leaf had fallen on him. Thor struck a second time, harder, and Skrymir asked, half asleep, whether an acorn had dropped from the branch above. Thor struck a third time, with everything left in his arm. Skrymir opened one eye and said he thought a twig might have brushed his brow. and went back to sleep. Thor said nothing more that night, and grew quieter about the whole matter with every mile they walked afterward. In the morning, Skrymir walked with them as far as a crossroads and turned to go his own way. Before he left, he said that the men of Utgard would think little of them for their size. He said they would do well to hold their tongues about their own strength once inside the walls, prouder travellers than they had gone in boasting and come out changed men if they came out at all. Then he swung the provision bag onto his shoulder and walked off into the trees. He was not seen again by any of them. The castle stood at the end of that road. The gate itself rose too high to see the top of it. None of the four travelling together could see it, no matter how far back they leaned their heads. Iron bars ran across the gate, set too close for any of them to force a shoulder between. Jalfi found a single gap in the grating wide enough to slip through sideways, and the rest followed him in one at a time. Inside lay a hall built to a scale that made Bilskirnir seem a farmer's cottage, benches running its length on both sides. On those benches sat men and women larger than any giant Thor had yet stood before. None of them troubled to rise when the travellers entered. At the high seat sat a lord who gave his name as Utgard Loki. He looked the four of them over slowly before he spoke. He said that no one came under his roof without some skill to show for it, however small. Idle men made poor company at a feast. He said, Loki, hungriest of the four after days on the road, said he would eat faster than any man in the hall. A trough was carried in and filled with meat. Loki was set at one end of it, and a hall servant named Logi at the other. Both worked toward the middle at a terrible pace, and they met there at the same moment. But Loki had eaten only the meat, while Logi had eaten the meat, the bones, and the trough itself. Loki lost, and said nothing further about eating for the rest of that evening. Jalfi, fastest of foot among men, was matched next against a runner named Hugi, over a course marked out on the plain beside the hall. In the first race, Hugi finished and turned back to meet Thjalfi before Thjalfi was halfway down the course. In the second race, the gap between them had only grown wider. In the third race, Hugi reached the far mark and was resting by the time Thjalfi crossed it. No one in the hall thought it worth calling for a fourth attempt, but Thor had watched two of his companions lose without lifting a hand himself, and restlessness of that kind never sat easily on him. He asked for a contest of drinking, since he had never once been outdrunk at any table in Asgard. A long horn was brought to him. Utgarda, Loki said, any man of standing drained it in a single pull, a lesser man in two. No man alive failed to empty it in three. Thor drank until his breath ran out and found the level in the horn scarcely lower. He drank a second time longer, with the same result. He drank a third time, with all the strength left in him. He lowered the horn to find it merely less full than before, and gave up the contest with his face dark. But Thor was not a god who accepted a single failure quietly, and he asked for something more suited to his true strength. Garda Loki, half smiling, said the young men of his hall amused themselves by lifting his grey cat off the floor. It was, he said, a small enough feat. Thor was welcome to try his hand at it. Thor set both palms under the cat's belly and heaved upward with all his strength. The cat only arched its back higher. With everything he had left in him, he managed to lift one paw clear of the floor and no more. Beaten a third time, Thor grew angry enough that Utgard Loki offered one match more. It was a wrestling bout against an old woman named Ellie, who sat nursing at the far end of the hall. No man there thought it fitting to wrestle Thor himself. Thor took hold of her, and the harder he strove against her, the firmer she stood. She brought him down onto one knee before the whole company, and there the match was called finished. In the morning, Utgard and Loki walked the four of them out beyond the gate. Once the walls stood well behind them, he told the whole truth of the visit plainly. A guest going home was owed that much. He said the wire on the provision bag had been bound with iron spells no living hand could loose. The 3 blows Thor had struck in the night had not landed on Skrymir's skull at all. They had landed on a mountain some distance off, where 3 square valleys now stood that had not been there before. Loki at the trough had been wildfire itself, which consumed wood, bone, and trough with equal ease. Hugi on the course had been thought, and no runner ever born would finish ahead of it. The horn Thor drank from stood with its far end in the open sea. The tide had gone out by the width of a fjord for his 3 pulls at it. It was a change sailors would mark for the rest of that season. The cat had been the Midgard serpent, wearing a shape small enough to carry into a hall. When Thor lifted one paw from the floor, he had lifted a coil of the serpent. It rose high enough that its back brushed the sky over the whole world. Ellie, last of all, had been old age, and no man born of woman had ever thrown her, nor ever would. Thor's hand went to Mjolnir before the giant had finished speaking. He meant to answer every trick with the one argument he trusted, but there was nothing left to strike. The castle, the gate, the great hall and its benches were gone from the ground entirely, and Utgard and Loki with them. Only the flat green country remained empty in every direction. Thor had held the world serpent's paw inside his own 2 hands, never suspecting it in all his strength. He stood a long while on the open plain, turning the truth of it over. Something in him already knew that he would want that grip again before the story of his life was finished. But there was no answer left to give, only the road home. Loki said nothing, and Chaffee said nothing. The 4 of them walked back the way they had come, west toward the wood and Bilskirnir beyond it. Behind them the plain lay wind-scoured and green, exactly as it had lain before any hall had ever stood on it. Nothing at all was left standing to mark where the gate had been. Part 13. The Ox Head and the Vale. The road west from that plain took 3 more days. Thor spoke very little on any of them. Bilskirnir took them in as it always did, torchlight running the length of both walls. Sif set out bread and cold mutton. Nobody in that house asked what had happened in the east. But what stayed with Thor was the weight that had come up through his own 2 palms before the paw left the floor. He wanted it again, and he wanted it in open water. There. Nothing could be dressed up as something small. The chance came out of an ordinary errand. Aegir kept a hall beneath the sea. He had been told to brew ale for all the gods at once. He replied that he owned no kettle deep enough. Until one was found, he said, the gods would have to drink elsewhere. Said quietly that his father Ymir kept a cauldron, a full league deep at the edge of the eastern sea. So Thor and Tyr went east together. They came at evening to a house of stone standing above a grey shore that smelled of salt and weed. Hymir's mother met them at the door. She had 900 heads on her shoulders, every one of them turning at a different speed. Mother came after her, gold-browed and fair, and carried ale to them in a horn. She hid the two of them under kettles at the end of the hall. Ymir came home in a poor humour most nights, and in a worse one some 8 kettles hung along a single beam above the door, black with soot and hammered thick. When the giant came in, the frost in his beard rang as he walked. His glance went along that beam and split 7 of the 8 down the middle. Only the deepest one held. Thor thought, watching that the cauldron alone was worth the journey, whatever else came of it. Ymir killed 3 oxen for supper. Thor ate 2 of them by himself, whole, and asked whether anything else was cooking. The giant said, without much warmth, that a guest with an appetite of that size would have to go out on the water in the morning. He would have to fish for his own supper. Thor said he was willing. Ymir replied that a man who meant to fish must first find his own bait. He pointed at the herd standing in the dark beyond the wall. Thor walked out among them and took hold of the largest black ox whose name was Ginnungagap. He twisted the head off it where it stood. Then he came back inside, carrying the head by one horn, and slept. They put out before first light, and Thor took both oars and rowed. Ymir had fished that coast since before there were men on it. He called out that they had come far enough, but Thor rowed on past the ground he named. The giant caught 2 whales on one line, hauling them over the gunwale, one after the other. He said this was a fair morning's work, and the boat should turn. Thor rowed further. The giant's own uneasiness surprised him. He had been afraid of very little in a long life, but the water under the keel had gone a colour he did not know. Then Thor shipped the oars and took up a line thicker than a ship's cable. He set the ox head on the hook and let it down into the dark. The serpent lay in its circle around the whole of Midgard, its own tail in its mouth. It opened for the bait. The hook went up through the roof of its mouth and held. What came up that line was not like the pulling of any fish. Thor braced himself, and his heels went through the planking of the boat. They went on, going until they found the sea floor, and stood on it. The serpent's head broke water within reach of the gunwale. Poison ran out of its jaws and hissed along the wet boards. It looked at Thor, and Thor looked back at it, and neither of them looked away. It was the nearest either of them would come to the other until the last morning of the world. He had wanted this since Utgard, and now he had it. The strength was going out of his arms in the having of it. But Ymir could not stand it. The serpent's head hung a hand's breadth from the boat, with Thor's fists still on the line. The giant took out his knife and cut the cable through. The serpent went back down into the water and was gone. Thor threw the hammer after it. Some said afterwards that the blow had killed it there in the sea, though plainly it had not. Everyone who told the story knew where the two of them would meet again. He turned round and struck Ymir over the ear with his bare fist. The giant went over the side and came up spluttering. Then Thor waded ashore, carrying the boat, the 2 whales, the bailing bucket, and the oars. He said nothing for a long while. Ymir would not simply hand over the cauldron. He said a strong man was known by whether he could break the cup on his table. Thor threw it against a stone pillar, and the pillar broke and the cup did not. His mother bent to Thor's ear. She whispered that nothing in that house was harder than the giant's own skull. Thor threw the cup at Hymir's head. The head kept its shape and the cup fell in pieces. Then Tyr tried twice to lift the cauldron and could not shift it. Thor set his feet, took the rim, and swung the whole thing up over his head. The rings along its side rang at his heels to the door. 39 giants came after them along the shore. Thor set the cauldron down, took the hammer, and left every one of them lying on the shingle. The ale was brewed at Aegir's that same autumn, but one morning in the winter that followed, Thor woke in Bilskirnir. The hammer was not where he had laid it. His hands went over the floor rushes in the dark. Then they went over the frozen grass of the yard outside. He felt along the cold ground on all fours before he trusted himself to say a word aloud. When he did speak, it was to Loki. His beard shook and his hair shook. He said, "The hammer is gone, and no one in the 9 worlds knows it yet." Loki went to Freyja and borrowed her falcon cloak and flew east. The feathers whistled as he went out over the fence of the world. He found Thrym, lord of the giants, sitting out on a grave mound in the wind, entirely at his ease. The giant was plaiting collars of gold thread for his hounds, and combing out the manes of his mares. He said the hammer lay 8 leagues down under the earth. No one would ever bring it up again, he said, unless Freyja were brought to him as his wife. Loki flew home with that answer and gave it in the hall. Freyja's refusal was heard in every building in Asgard. She snorted with such fury that the halls trembled on their foundations. Brisingamen burst off her throat and went across the floor in gold pieces. The gods sat in council, and Heimdall, who saw further ahead than the rest, gave the plan. Thor would go himself in a bridal veil, with the keys of a household hung at his belt. Thor said flatly that the gods would call him a woman for it as long as he lived. Loki replied that giants would be keeping house in Asgard inside a month if he did not go. So they dressed him. Linen went over the red beard, and the veil was pinned close at the temples. 3 brooches sat on his breast, a ring of keys at his waist, and Brisingamen mended hung at his throat. Nothing about it pleased him. He would remember the walk out to the chariot longer than he remembered anything that came after. Loki went beside him as the bridesmaid, and the goats were harnessed. The mountains split and the earth burned along the whole road east. Thrym had the benches spread before the chariot reached his gate. Thrym never suspected that the shape sitting so still under all that linen weighed more than the roof tree above him. He called out that his gold-horned cattle should be driven in. He said his black oxen were a joy to a giant's eye, and that he had lacked nothing in his hall but Freyja. An ox was roasted whole and set before the bride, with 8 salmon after it. Every dainty in the hall was put out for the women. The bride ate the whole of it and drank 3 casks of mead on top. Thrym said down the table that he had never seen a woman eat so wide or drink so deep. Loki replied that the bride had not touched food for 8 nights. So hot had her longing been for Jotunheim. Then Thrym stooped to kiss her and lifted the linen, and went backwards the whole length of the hall from what was under it. He called out that the bride's eyes were burning, and that fire came out of them onto the boards. Loki replied that she had not slept for 8 nights either, for the same reason. Thrym's sister came along the benches then and asked for the bride gift, the red gold rings off the bride's arms. But Thrym had already given the order that pleased him best. He called for Mjolnir to be carried in and laid on the maiden's knees. The 2 of them might be hallowed together in the name of Var. Thor's heart laughed in his chest when the iron came down across his lap. He killed Thrym first, before the giant had straightened up from the laying of it. Then he killed the whole of that household in the hall where it sat. The servants died at the doors, the guests along both walls, and last of all the old sister. She got a blow across the skull instead of the ring she had asked for. He drove home under a black sky with Loki quiet on the seat beside him and the hammer lying flat across his knees. Behind the chariot, the torn bridal veil streamed out on the wind, pale against the dark. It stayed knotted at one corner, where the pin had held it. Part 14. Baldr. The hammer went back to its place on the table in Bilskirnir, and after that there were quiet years. Asgard had whole strings of them, when the gods rode out and came home and quarrelled over nothing, of everyone living in those halls. The best loved by far was Odin's second son, and his name was Baldr. His hall was called Bridablik, the broad gleaming, and it stood where the light reached earliest in the morning. Nothing unclean had ever been carried in through its doors, and it was white inside and out, the timbers scrubbed pale. No soot marked the roof beams, and the hearth was swept clean every morning before anyone asked. Baldr himself was so white to look at that men named a small flower in the northern fields after his eyelashes. They had nothing whiter to compare it to, yet there was one thing about him the poems never explained away. No judgment he gave was ever allowed to stand. Then Baldr began to dream badly, and he dreamed the same dark things several nights running. The dreams were about his own life, and how little of it was left. He told them in the hall plainly, the way a man reported the weather. It was the change in the room afterwards that everyone remembered. Nobody laughed and nobody drank, and the Aesir went out and sat in council on it before the fire had burned down. But Odin did not stay long in that council. He saddled Sleipnir and rode down out of Asgard alone, down and eastward. The road went to Niflhel, and a hound came up the way to meet him, its breast and jaws wet with blood. It bayed at him and let him pass. He rode on until the earth thundered under the hoofs, and then he came to the high eastern door of Hel's country. East of that door lay a grave mound old, sunk at one side with frost in the grass over it. Odin stood at the head of it and sang the corpse-raising charms. A seeress, who had been dead for ages, was forced up out of the ground against her will. She said she was heavy with snow, beaten with rain, and wet with dew. She had been dead a long time. Inside the gate, plain to see from where they stood, a hall had been made ready for somebody. Mead stood brewed in it, with a bright shield laid over the vat to keep the dust off. Odin, calling himself a wanderer, asked whom the hall was waiting for. She replied that the mead was brewed for Baldr, and that the Aesir had no joy left in them. He asked who Baldr's killer was to be, and she replied that Hod would bear the high branch there. He asked who would avenge it, and she replied that a son of Odin, one night old, would kill. He would neither wash his hands nor comb his hair until Baldr's slayer was carried to the fire. Then he asked one thing more, about the maidens who would weep and throw their veils to the wind. She knew him from the asking of it. She called out that he was no wanderer at all, but Odin. She told him to ride home and be glad, since nobody would come to wake her again until Loki was loose. Then she went back down into the mound, but Frigg went a different way about it. She walked out through the worlds and took an oath from every dangerous thing in them, one at a time. Not one of them would harm her son. Fire swore and water swore. Iron swore, and every other metal after it. Stone swore, and the earth and the trees growing out of it. Sicknesses swore, and beasts and birds and poison and the serpents lying in the grass. She came home to Fensalir with the whole of creation bound behind her. West of Valhalla there was a young shoot growing on a tree, a green thing no thicker than a finger. She had walked past it without stopping, and it had seemed to her too young to be asked to swear anything. Its name was mistletoe. After that the gods made a game of it at the thing. Baldr stood up in the middle of the meeting place, and everyone there threw whatever came to hand at him. They shot arrows into him and pitched stones. They swung axes at his head and put spears in underarm, and nothing touched him at all. Not one of them, laughing at the spears turning aside in the air, understood that the game itself was the trap. But one of them did not care for the game. He went to Fensalir in the shape of an old woman leaning on a stick. Frigg, who knew all fates and had never spoken one of them aloud, said easily enough that everything in the world had sworn to spare Baldr. Everything had sworn except a single shoot west of Valhalla, too young to be worth troubling. The old woman thanked her and went out. Loki pulled the mistletoe up and carried it back to the meeting place. It stood at the edge of the ring, blind, with nothing at all to aim with. Loki came and stood beside him. He said it was a poor thing that he alone did his brother no honour. Replied that he could not see where Baldr stood and had nothing to throw. Loki said he would show him where to aim. He put the shoot into his hand and turned him by the shoulders. Threw it. It went through Baldr. Baldr fell down dead on the grass in front of all of them. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, partly because the ground was a sanctuary where no blood could be avenged. None of them could get a word out either. They looked at one another, and then they looked at Odin. Odin's silence was the worst thing in that field. He alone knew exactly what had been let out and how far it went. He knew which morning it ended on. They carried the body down to the sea. Baldr's ship, Hringhorni, was the largest ship ever built, and they meant to burn him aboard it. But the ship would not shift off the shingle. Word was sent to Jotunheim, and a giantess named Hyrrokin came down out of the mountains, riding a wolf with vipers twisted together for reins. 4 berserks were needed to hold the animal after she got down, and managed only by knocking it flat. She set one hand on the prow and pushed. The ship went down the rollers so hard that the wood took fire under it, and the whole land shook. Thor wanted to break her head for it and was talked out of it. They laid Baldr aboard. Nanna, his wife, watched him carried up the plank, and her heart broke in her breast where she stood. She died of it, and they laid her beside him. Odin put the ring Draupnir on the pyre with his son, and a dwarf called Lita came too near the fire as it was lit. Thor kicked him into it, and he burned with the rest. Before the flame took hold, Odin stooped over the body and whispered something into the ear of the corpse. Nobody ever learned what it was. They came from everywhere to stand on that beach. And Odin came with Frigg and the Valkyries. Freya came in his chariot, drawn by the golden boar, and Freyja came with her cats, and Heimdall rode down on Gulltop. The frost giants and the mountain giants came too, and stood along the shingle among the gods with no hand raised. Nothing that day was worth a quarrel. Then the ship went out, burning on the tide, and the smoke climbed straight up in the still air. The people on the beach watched it until there was nothing left to watch. Frigg asked afterwards for a rider to go down to hell and offer a ransom for him. Harmod, another of Odin's sons, said that he would go. They gave him Sleipnir, and he rode 9 nights through valleys, so dark that he could not see the horse underneath him. He never once got down. Then he came to the river Gjöll, and to the bridge laid over it. The bridge was thatched with gold, and shone in a country where nothing else did. A maiden named Modgud kept that bridge and stopped him on it. She called out that 5 whole companies of dead men had ridden across the day before. They had made less noise under her feet than he made alone. Hermod said he was going to look for Baldr, and she replied that Baldr had crossed already. The road to Hell went downward and northward from the far end of the planks. He rode on until he came to the gate, which was barred and higher than any gate in Asgard. He tightened the girths, sat down deep in the saddle, and set the horse at it. Lipnir went over so cleanly that nothing touched the bar. Inside, in the high seat of that hall, Baldr sat with Nanna beside him. Hermod stayed the night there and did not sleep. In the morning he begged Hel for his brother. He said there was such weeping among the Aesir that the loss could not be borne. He replied that she would find out whether Baldr was as beloved as they said. If every single thing in all the worlds, living and dead, wept for him, she said, then he could ride home. If one thing refused, she would keep what she had. Hermod rode back with Draupnir, which Baldr sent to his father. He carried too a linen robe that Nanna sent to Frigg, and a gold ring for Fulla. Then messengers went out over the 9 worlds and asked everything in them to weep Baldr out of Hell. And everything did. Men wept, and women wept, and the beasts in the fields and the birds over them. The earth wept, and the stones wept where they lay, and the trees wept, and every metal in the ground wept. They wept exactly as those things wept when they came out of hard frost into a thaw and ran wet all over. For a while the whole world was dripping and soft and running with water. It ran the way a country ran in the first warm week after a long winter. The ice went off the eaves, the ground turned dark, and the streams came up over their banks. But one of the messengers came at last to a cave in the rocks. In it sat a giantess who gave her name as Thok. She was asked to weep like everything else. She sat where she was, beside a fire burned down almost to nothing. She replied that Thok would weep dry tears over Baldr's burning, and that she had got no good of the man alive or dead. He could keep what she had. She said, Baldr stayed where he was, and men said afterwards that the giantess in the cave had been Loki. The messengers rode back with the answer, and there was nothing left to try. When anyone came looking for the cave afterwards, it stood empty. The fire in it had gone out and gone cold, and the ash lay undisturbed in its ring of stones. Outside, in the hard frost of the doorway, a single line of tracks led away from the mouth of it. The tracks were unhurried and evenly spaced, going up toward the mountains. Part 15, Ragnarok. After Baldr was burned, there was no more ease in Asgard. The gods went on with the ordinary business of the worlds. But something had gone out of it. Aegir brewed his ale again that season. In the cauldron Thor had carried off the eastern shore. He set a feast under the sea for all of them. Gold was laid along the floor of that hall in place of firelight, and it lit the whole room by itself. The cups filled again as fast as they were emptied. Loki came down to it too, and had not been asked. Aegir's servant Fimofeng was praised round the benches for how well he waited on the guests. Loki killed him for it, with a knife in the middle of the hall. They drove him out into the wood for that, but he came back in through the door, took a seat by the fire, and began. What he did that night was not a quarrel. He went round the benches and told every single god present the truest and worst thing about them. He missed nobody, one after another. He named what each of them had done and had hoped was not known. He left nothing standing of any of them, and to Frigg, in front of the whole company, he said plainly that it was his own doing. She would never see Baldr ride home again. She sat and heard it and gave him no answer at all. The hall stayed quiet a long while after that. Then Thor came in from the east with the hammer in his fist. Loki, who had answered everybody else, stopped speaking to the room and spoke only to him. He said he would go, and that he had said what he came to say. At the door he called back that Aegir might brew well, but that fire would play over all of it, and over Aegir's own back. He had poured his last ale for anybody, he said. Then he went out and was gone. It was the last time any of the gods saw him standing free. He went up into the fells and built himself a house at Frenanger above a waterfall. It had a door in each of its 4 walls, so that he could watch every direction at once. Whenever anyone came up the slope, he took the shape of a salmon and lay in the pool under the fall. But he sat in the house by day, sitting by the fire one morning with linen twine in his hands. He worked out how a mesh might be knotted. It could take a fish out of running water. He was the first in the world to think of it. Men long afterwards would use the thing every day without knowing whose invention it had been. When he saw the gods coming over the ridge, he threw it into the fire and went down to the water. But the ash of it kept its shape in the embers, squares and knots and all. The gods bent over the hearth and read it. Some said it was Kvasir who read it, though Kvasir had been dead a long age by then. They sat down and knotted a net exactly like the burnt one, and dragged the pool with it from both banks. Loki went over the head rope the first time and came down in the water below. They dragged it again with weights on the foot rope, and he leapt a second time out toward the open sea. Thor waded down the middle of the river as the net came on. Loki went up into the air, and Thor's hand closed on him above the tail. The fish slid a long way in that grip, and the grip held, and that was why salmon had tapered tails ever afterwards. They carried him to a cave and brought his 2 sons in after him. Vali, the younger, was changed into a wolf where he stood. He tore his brother Narfi to pieces on the floor in front of their father. The gods took Narfi's entrails and bound Loki with them across 3 stone slabs set on edge. 1 slab lay under his shoulders, 1 under his loins, 1 under his knees. The guts turned to iron on him as they were knotted. Skadi, who had never forgotten her father, brought a serpent and fixed it in the rock above his face. The venom dripped down onto him. Sigyn, his wife, sat down beside him with a bowl and held it up under the drops. When the bowl filled, she had to turn away and carry it out and empty it. In that time the venom fell on his face, and he writhed so hard that the whole earth shook. Men called that an earthquake and went on with what they were doing. There he would lie until the last morning of the world. But that morning was already on its way, and everyone in Asgard knew what it would look like. Odin had been told the whole of it long before, and had never once managed to unhear it. It began with the weather. Snow came in from 3 directions at once, and did not go off again. There were 3 winters laid end to end, with no summer set between them. Men called that whole stretch the Fimble winter. The frost went further down into the ground each year and did not come up. Nothing sown came to anything. What was in the barns went, and then what was in the houses went. After that, men began to look at one another differently. It was an axe age and a sword age, with shields split from rim to boss. It was a wind age and a wolf age before the world went down. Brothers killed brothers for what lay in their storerooms, and sons of sisters broke the bond of kin. No oath sworn anywhere in those years would be kept by the man who swore it. Then Skoll caught the sun at last in open sky and swallowed her. Hati caught the moon and swallowed him, exactly as the gods had known from the first morning that they must. The stars went out of the heavens one after another and did not come back. The earth was left shaking in the dark, and the sea got up over the shore. On one morning in that darkness 3 cocks crowed. The first was Fjalar red as rust, and he crowed in the gallows wood in Jotunheim, and the giants got up. The second was Gullinkambi, gold-combed, and he crowed in Asgard over Odin's roof, and the Aesir got up. The third crowed under the earth in Hel's hall, sooty red, and the dead got up and did not lie down again. Garm began baying before Nipperhelia, where he had been chained since anyone could remember, and the chain gave. Yggdrasil shuddered from its highest branch to its lowest root, and everything living in it and under it groaned. Then Heimdall, who had needed less sleep than a bird for the whole life of the world, had kept his horn against exactly this. He set it to his mouth and blew. Once the note went into all 9 worlds in the same moment, and everything living heard it. It would not be blown a second time. The bindings all went together. Fenrir came up off the island with his jaws open so wide that the lower one lay along the ground. The upper one was against the sky. Fire ran out of his eyes and his nostrils. Jormungandr came ashore, blowing poison over the air and the water, and the sea rose behind it and went out over the fields. In that flood, a ship came loose, which had been building since the world began, made out of the nails of dead men. Its name was Naglfar. Loki stood at its steering oar with all Hel's people aboard. Out of the south came Surtur with fire in front of him and fire behind. He had a sword in his hand, brighter than the sun had ever been. The sons of Muspel rode up over Bifrost, and the trembling road broke under their hooves and would never carry anything again. They came out at last on the same plain. It was called Vigrid, and it lay 108 leagues along every side. Everything living in the 9 worlds stood on it. Odin rode out in front in a gold helmet with Gungnir in his hand and went straight at the wolf. It went as he had always known it would go. Fenrir took him whole and swallowed him, and that was the end of the Allfather. He had paid an eye to see this coming, and had never been able to move a single step of it. But Odin had a son who had said almost nothing in the whole of his life. Vidar came in on the wolf then, wearing on one foot a shoe made up over the length of the world. It was made out of every scrap of leather ever cut from a toe or a heel and thrown away. It had been kept for the one moment when it would be needed. He set that foot in the wolf's lower jaw, took the upper jaw in his hand, and tore the head apart. Thor met the serpent, as both of them had known they must, since the ox head came up out of the dark water. He killed it with the hammer. Then he walked 9 steps back from it. He fell down dead in the poison it had breathed over him, and he would go no further than that. Freya met Surtur with nothing at all in his hand, having given his sword away for a wife long before. He fought as well as any of them, and fell all the same. And the hound Garm came together and killed each other. The one hand Tyr had left was the last thing he had to fight with. Heimdall and Loki came together and killed each other likewise. It was fitting enough, since neither of them had ever been able to leave the other alone. When the fighting on the plain was over, Surtur flung his fire out across the whole of it. It took Asgard first, then Vigrid, then Midgard inside its fence of eyebrows. Then it took everything else that would burn, which was everything there was. The smoke went up so high that it darkened what little sky was left. Yggdrasil burned and did not fall. Then the sea came in over all of it, over the ash and the hot stone and the bones of the gods. The land went down under the water, and there was nothing anywhere above the surface. But that was not the end of it either. After a time the earth came up out of the water a second time green. The water ran off it and went back into the sea. Fields stood on it, heavy with grain that no one had sown, and the unsown fields would feed whoever came. An eagle flew above the high falls, hunting fish, as an eagle had done over the first shore of all. Vidar and Vali walked up onto Idavol, where Asgard had stood, and found the ground clean and level. Modi and Magni came up out of the ash, carrying the hammer between them. It had outlasted its owner as it had outlasted its maker. Baldr came up out of hell with Hod beside him, the two of them together, and no word said between them about the branch. They sat down in the new grass and talked over everything that had happened. Lying in that grass where they sat were the old golden gaming pieces of the gods, all of them. They had been lost when the world went down, and found again for nothing. But two people in a wood had never been burned at all. Their names were Life and Lifrasir, and they had hidden in Hodmimer's holt while the fire went over the world. They had lived the whole of that time on nothing but the morning dew. They came out into the light and looked at the new country, and every family afterwards came down from those two. It was exactly as every family before had come down from two pieces of driftwood on a shore. High over them a chariot went along the old road, driven by a daughter the sun had borne before the wolf caught her. She kept her mother's way across the sky as steadily as if nothing had ever interrupted it. The fire had gone out, the water had gone back, the grass had come up over all of it. None of it was written down for a very long time. The poems went north in the heads of people who could not read a line of them. They travelled on ships, across salt water, from one cold coast to another. They came at last to Iceland there, 700 winters or so after the last man had truly believed a word of them. Somebody sat through a winter in a farmhouse. The frost stood on the inside of the wall. He wrote them out on the stretched calf skin to save them. The skin was scraped and cut and sewn by hand. The ink was made of willow and bearberry. One small book of it went into a chest and stayed in that country for 400 years more. Everything told afterwards came out of it. The names did not go away either. They went on, sitting inside the ordinary words for the days of the week, unnoticed, in daily use, and Fru and Frigg were named aloud, all week long, by people with no idea that they were doing it. Wednesday held one of them, Thursday held another, and the tree kept standing, not in any country a man could walk to, but inside the story itself. 3 roots went down into places that still had no names. 9 worlds hung in its branches like fruit that was never picked. The world had been made once out of a body, and unmade once in fire, and made again out of water and grass. That was the shape of the whole thing. And the shape did not close. Somewhere the rhyme was already coming down again into a mild place in the middle of the emptiness. Somewhere a small ash, no taller than a child, was already up in ground that nobody had walked on. And the story went on as it had always gone on, told and told again through the smoke and the dark and the long winters, and not once finished, and the last word of it never yet spoken by anybody.